Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. How are you guys doing this morning? My name is Jamal Thomas. This is indeed my show. I hope you guys are doing well. Everyone can hear me. As I always tell you, you could be anywhere this morning. So I am always glad and happy that you have decided to be here with me. And I appreciate you being here with me. I apologize that I couldn't get here yesterday. I had medical issues that I had to attend to, but I am here today and I will be here with you for the rest of the week. As you see, I'm in a new spot. It's a nice place. I'm back home in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm going to be in Richmond, Virginia for the foreseeable future. But hopefully you can be here with me as we go about our day and then we go about our new year. A lot of interesting news has taken place, and a lot of big news is being made by Donald Trump himself, the man who's going into office coming up, on the 20th of January, where he's going to be sworn in. The Congress members are now in on their spots. And so now we're waiting for 47? I don't know the exact number the president Donald Trump represents, but we are waiting for Trump to get back in office and figure out what Donald Trump is going to do when he gets in office. One of the big things that he has put on his agenda that he didn't say anything about over the course of the election is stealing Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. You think I'm joking, but no. Donald Trump has been putting out one threat after the next against Canada, mocking it, saying it's going to be the 51st state. In fact, as you know, Justin Trudeau has stepped down. He was a massively failed prime minister. And as a massively hated and failed prime minister, he stepped out before his term had even expired. But Trump, if you remember, Justin Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't necessarily have the best things to say about Trudeau. And in one situation said Trudeau broke down into tears during the time that Trudeau came to Mar-a-Lago when Trump said he was going to put sanctions on him. And I have the clip. I want to play this clip. There's a few clips of Donald Trump, actually. Many of these are pretty astonishing because what Donald Trump is arguing is that Greenland needs to be within the U.S. sphere of influence. He goes further, saying, I don't even know if Denmark has a claim to it. How do I know that Denmark has a claim to it? They need to just, hand it over. And from the standpoint of Donald Trump in Canada, he pointed out that, well, we will use economic force if we need to in order to take Canada. Canada should be the 51st state. Now, Trudeau said this is never going to happen. Fair enough. But Donald Trump is escalating one threat after the next. What's wild about this, and I started to think, what will Greenland do about it? Or what would Denmark do about it? What are you going to do about it? Even if we did take Denmark, what is, Greenland, what can Denmark do about it? What are you going to do? Put a military force against the United States? For that matter, what is Europe going to do about it? What European military is going to stand against the United States? And there's the rub. The U.S. has been perfectly okay with Israel destroying any notion of world order. And even if you think about it from the standpoint of Georgia, Romania, in many of these places, the rule of law no longer really applied because they didn't necessarily follow in with the dictates of either NATO or, for that matter, the West. Meaning if a candidate wins it, and the candidate wins it on a ticket that they don't want to get into war, well, that is not a position that NATO or the European Union really accepts in Romania or, for that matter, Georgia, which is why they've been trying to overthrow the Georgian government. And the court got involved in Romania in order to kill the candidacy of a guy who would have most likely won that race. You have something similar taking place in South Korea. You have something similar taking place in Syria, where it was overthrown, and even in Ukraine. Because I know that many people in the West will say, well, wait a minute, Russia overthrew the government of Ukraine. And I would say, no. The Yanukovych government in 2014 was overthrown by elements of the West using Nazis as a battering ram to overthrow that government. And as opposed to them saying, well, wait a minute, this is outrageous. We have a rule of law. We have the situation where you can't just overthrow governments you don't particularly like because you don't like their political allegiances or political affiliations, or for that matter, where they fall in a political spectrum. What did they say? They say, this is a revolution of dignity. That's what they said. Even when the U.S. knocked over Iraq, there was a huge complaints about it when we invaded Syria, when we invaded Afghanistan. Again, there weren't these massive complaints about it from the international community. And it wasn't like Europe put its foot down. No, they went along with each and everything that the United States did, including and up to Ukraine. And even if you want to talk about attacking Yugoslavia, I'm saying in all of these situations, Europe went along with it. Europe was okay with it because it went within the context of European, let's say, political bona fides working in coordination with America to do it. Europe doesn't really have a military per se. So how would Europe stop it? You have, for all intents and purposes, lumped in with the US as if we are your mob boss. And now we're saying that rent is going up. And maybe part of that rent is, hey, you have a nice Greenland there. Maybe we need to, take a hold of that to help you out. We'll just hold on to it for you. Hey, Canada's looking pretty good up there. Hey, maybe, you need us to hold on to Canada for you. It's okay. We'll take good care of it. Hey, Panama Canal, you're looking pretty good down there. Maybe you need us to just hold on to that for you. It's okay. We'll take good care of it. Meaning, in Ukraine, they called it a revolution of dignity. In Syria, they were okay with it because, again, we were back in the jihadists. In Romania, well, they didn't particularly like that candidate because he came out of nowhere and there were TikTok videos that freaked them out. So, it's okay if the court gets involved and kill that case. Also, Georgia, where Europe itself were getting involved and trying to overthrow the government of Georgia in a Maidan 2.0 because they didn't necessarily like the government that was in. In each of these cases, Europe was okay with blowing off any notion of representative government, or for that matter, any notion of democratic norms. And they did it with a smile, and they did it with applause. And now that Trump is looking at Greenland, and Trump is looking at the Panama Canal, and Trump been looking at Canada, now they have feelings about it. You've allowed this world to be constructed in this way because you were okay with breaking any notion of democratic norms in cases that you didn't like. Now that Donald Trump is in, and Donald Trump is saying, you're looking pretty sexy over there, Greenland. Maybe you should let us hold on to that for you. Now they take issue. And more to the point, you're taking issue in a situation that you have no power to do anything about it. You've made the choice that might is right. And you thought Mike was right because you thought that you could lump in with the US. So anything that we did it, where we were using force in order to do it, whether it was with proxies or whether it was direct, you went along with it because as you were lumping in with us, might is right. The US has one of the most powerful militaries in the world. And so we are on the side of right. Now we're looking at your property. You don't think it's all that right. You don't think it's all that right. I'm saying that the tenor, the premise was set because Europe ignored democratic norms in situations where Europe was okay with. And now in a situation where they're not okay with, now they have feelings. Now they have issues. They have feels. They have feels. Yeah. Here's the rub. If Trump did decide to take Greenland, what would Europe do about it? That is the question. And the answer to that question is they would bitch, they would moan, they would complain, but ultimately, nothing. Ultimately, nothing. They can do nothing about it. That's how weak Europe has gotten. And think about it in these terms also. I've often, when I was in Europe, would ask people, why do you allow yourselves to be treated in this way? And they are often bewildered by me asking them that. And the reason why I'm asking that, think about what has taken place over the last several years. Europe was getting cheap energy from Russia, very cheap energy from Russia. And it allowed Europe to be Europe, meaning that garden, as they called it, was allowed to be a garden because for all intents and purposes, they were able to get energy in a way that allowed them to be that garden. All right. The US also had an oil market. We hated the pipelines, especially Nord Stream, because we didn't necessarily like the connection between Europe and Russia. And we preferred Europe to buy our product as opposed to buying their product. NATO, expands to the border of Russia, something that all of them knew was a red line. And they continue to push further. The overthrow of the government of Ukraine takes place in 2014. Yanukovych is out. Europe calls it a revolution of dignity. Russia gets involved because at that point they're killing ethnic Russian Ukrainians, and there's a massive military on the Russian border. And they've made a point, going back for the last, 20 years or more, that the expansion of NATO was a red line. All right. Now, instead of Europe being an honest actor and acknowledging a hostile military force on the border of Russia is not going to be tolerated, that's going to be problematic, meaning being an honest actor, they didn't do that. They decided to lump in with the U.S. The U.S. comes out and says, we're going to pass sanctions. And some of those sanctions, we're going to get rid of oil, basically energy, LNG, gas, oil, energy, anything coming from Russia, we want to put sanctions on. Okay, fair enough. Well, the U.S. has energy. So that doesn't damage us in a way that it damages Europe, but Europe goes along with it. Fair enough. Europe called it an energy war, despite the fact that they were the ones that passed the sanctions. All right. So in one step, Europe has damaged itself by chopping itself off from the energy that it got. Now, truth be told, it was still getting energy from Russia, but it was getting it through third parties where they had to pay a markup. So not only were they paying now like 5 times more for energy from us, or extra amount more in the markup that they were getting from Saudi Arabia or India, they were still getting it from Russia also. So you're now paying more for a product than what you were getting before, in a product that is necessary for your country to run. If you go to make toilet paper, you need energy in order to make the toilet paper to do it. So in one sense, all of this money is coming out of Europe now for energy. They blow up Nord Stream. They cut the other one off, meaning they're not taking the gas. So Europe now, their industries leave because they can't afford to function in Europe, especially in countries like Germany. So not only are you paying more for energy, you have deindustrialized many of the corporations of companies that were in your country in the first place, with those countries coming to the US. You spend hundreds of billions of dollars. Where's the money going? Well, the money is going to the US because the overwhelming majority of the weapons that are going to Ukraine is coming from America. So not only are you spending all of this money that is coming to us, you are also now spending a huge amount of money on energy that is also coming to us. Your companies are coming to us. So you've allowed yourself to be damaged in this way with policy that is not to the benefit of your country or for the people in that country, but ours. So now that Trump looks around and says, well, our vassals have allowed us to do all this. Why wouldn't they let us go further? Europe has put itself in this position. Nobody else. Europe has allowed itself to be this weak and has allowed itself to be seen as a vassal. And now that Trump is seeing them for what they are, now they're taking issue. I have no idea if Trump is going to go through with this or not, but he is spreading military force in regards to Panama Canal and in regards to Greenland, saying that these are necessary for America's security. And as for Canada, he's threatening economic force. It's just utterly astonishing. Mark is going to be here shortly, and I'm going to get an opportunity to go through this a little bit later in the show. But I'll show this first clip with Trump talking about, which one is this? So he has a few of these clips. I want to go to this one, though, where he goes into having this conversation about Russia. And for the first time, he gives an honest assessment of the reason that the war started. And I appreciate him for doing this, actually, because usually you don't hear anybody say it. But I want to go to my guest first. We could talk about this later. I am joined with the one and only Mark Sloboda. Mark Sloboda is an international relations and security analyst. Mark, Happy New Year, man. How you doing today? You doing all right?
Jamarl, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And Novum Golden, Happy New Year, such as it may be to you and you as well.
And Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Christmas was yesterday for us in this part of the world.
Exactly.
I'm not so sure merry is really the word that it doesn't translate well in my mind. See,
Really?
no, yeah, because it's a very different holiday.
Okay.
Western Christmas is conflated with a whole bunch of lovely pagan traditions, right? Gift giving, Christmas trees, right? Or things that evolved from pagan traditions when
Right.
the Catholic Church basically co-opted Yuletide, and previous Roman traditions and everything to capture, the zeitgeist, the minds of the public, and everything. Whereas in Russia, all of those pagan trappings still exist, but they're conflated into New Year's.
I
So
see.
all the gift giving, the Christmas trees, fireworks, all this sort of thing takes place on New Year's. So when Christmas, Orthodox Christmas, rolls around on January 7th, it is entirely a religious affair. It is
Oh,
all
interesting.
it's all about the Christ, right? Or however you choose to interpret it. So actually, it's kind of a dream of American conservatives in a way, and I think that separation of holiday traditions, it kind of does away with all of this, holidays culture war. That's just, it's so repetitive, it's nauseating in my mind.
Yeah.
You're sticking Santa Claus and you're taking the Christ out of Christmas. Well, here it's entirely different, right? Because all of that, right? We don't have Santa Claus, we have Father Frost and his cute little snow maiden Snegorotchka, who always, there's always a little going on there in the slinky little outfits for her. But that's all on New Year's, and then Christmas is entirely a rather sober religious affair for those who are Orthodox and religious, right? It still falls on a long stretch of Russian holidays through the season, but that's it's kind of like for everybody, so it's not delineated. And if you're Orthodox and you choose to celebrate, in a religious way or in a social way, that's what it's there for. For everyone else, they're still drinking the New Year's in or out, or okay, that's to be honest, Russians drink a lot less than they used to, and actually a lot less than most Europeans now. But anyway, it's just a very different separation of the holiday. So merry isn't quite the word that I would translate it at. Maybe joyous for those who are religious, or just, right? Or whatever divine importance it has. Yeah, it has for the Orthodox believers, which are a majority of the well, the majority of the Russian population identifies as Orthodox.
Okay.
According to the actual church attendance rates and everything, it's a lot like in the States. They really jump up on Christmas and Easter, but Russia is still largely a secular, multi-confessional society.
That's fair. Okay, so happy belated joyous Christmas.
Yes, Christmas. All right, whatever. To those who celebrate, which I know many. I'm not one of them, but for those who do, I have full
good
respect.
on them. Yeah.
It's all on you, buddy. Enjoy.
So, Mark, I want to get into Ukraine. Seems to be having a bad day, or at the very least, they've had a bad week. There's been the fall of Kharkiv. There's also been the repelling of a counteroffensive that they tried to throw. I want to give a shout out to you because a week before they threw the counteroffensive, you mentioned, well, it looks like they're gearing up for a counteroffensive, and 3 days later, they go through with it.
I think they're still gearing up. I think that was just a diversionary myself.
Oh, diversionary tactic. Oh, so you think they're trying a larger counteroffensive?
I think that's the case, but a lot of it depends on on how much forces they're capable of mustering and directing, while Russia, of course, is trying to deteriorate those forces before they can be put into the fray. I think they have intentions of it, right? But they're also having a lot of problems with desertions, a lot of these new forces. I mean, even while some of the new forces, the 155th, were training in France, they were deserting in France already, right? You know, well before in the battlefield. So, in significant numbers. We're not talking ones and twos, right? We're talking significant numbers. So, I believe they have intentions of launching more offensive, whether in the Kursk area or elsewhere. You know, we'll have to see. I would suspect Bryansk or Zaporozhye they still have significant buildup of forces there. But again, we'll see, because this offensive, or offensive is not the right word, right? This was a local counterattack. And I saw, a whole bunch of Ukrainian channels were calling it an offensive, and Russian commentators started picking it up. This is not an offensive, right? This was a local counterattack that was significant as a local counterattack. But for the amount of forces that were involved, to call it an offensive is kind of offensive in military terms. It wasn't that. Like I said, it was a significant counterattack that ultimately failed. First of all, it's clear that the Russians knew exactly where and when it was coming and what it would consist of. And not only that, the Kiev regime's commentators on social media were going ballistic, because evidently the plans were so widespread that a couple days before, Spanish military bloggers were discussing exactly the towns they were going to hit beforehand. Now, that's not to say that, they didn't have some initial, there's zero strategic or military success, right? Or in this, right? They were pumping more forces into Kursk and trying to move up to kind of the northwest of the Suja pocket for a bunch of hamlets that has zero discernible real reason. I mean, not even in the direction of the Kursk nuclear power plant, which would have been more to the west. It was more to the northeast. Sorry. I don't understand, other than information war purposes, which obviously failed disastrously as well, why they would have done this. Maybe they had some reason to believe that Russian forces would be particularly weak in that direction. Maybe that's simply, but if that was so, then that was drastically wrong. They just targeted a number of hamlets, and they surged forward and took about half of a number of hamlets for a day or two, and they've already been soundly defeated and pushed out of those. Now, they had a number of they had a number of tanks, a number of armored vehicles, but there's a couple of interesting things. One is, evidently there are reports that they were utilizing a new electronic warfare system that had like a sphere-shaped diameter of area of effect in the lead, right? In over the demining vehicle, the demining tank, and the tanks that were following it in the initial vanguard of at least one of the convoys. And evidently Russian, presumably provided by the West, right? Now, the reports, again, unconfirmed, are that traditional Russian FPV drones were useless. They were losing contact with them as soon as they entered. It was a small area of effect, but definitive. However, this is the thing, is that Russian forces have already, to a very significant degree over the last half a year, shifted to fiber optic cable controlled drones, which seems, when I first heard of it, it seemed absolutely improbable, right? These are like micro fine fiber optic, incredibly long. And you would think they would, I don't know, get stuck on something.
You think
really don't understand how they work, but they do. And so the effectiveness of this electronic warfare jamming was diluted because Russians have already started using to such a great extent the fiber optic drones that are completely invulnerable to electronic warfare jamming. So they quickly shifted to all of that. Also, Russians pulled up some Ka-52 alligators that we haven't seen really since the Zaporozhye offensive days. They obviously had those in place to help deal with it, and it kind of became a turkey shoot, right? Now, some of the armored vehicles were obviously able to unload some of the troops they were carrying, but all of the tanks, all of the demining vehicles, most of the armored vehicles, everything quickly was destroyed. It has not been a successful, counterattack for the amount of forces that were lost in it. And another interesting thing, again, reports on the ground, is that it seems that a very large number of these troops that were involved in this counterattack were prisoners, that they were prisoners. And this was, they identified them, not only once they captured some and interviewed them, but a very large number of prison tattoos on bodies and the like. So it seems that a very significant number of these troops may have been considered, shall we say, disposable. I mean,
wow,
beyond above and beyond what the Kiev regime normally considers its troops to be. So a scattering of some, of their remaining top, elite ideological troops, but then large numbers of prisoners as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, whether it's, my understanding is that prisoners are now forced, but it's also part of, you serve, you get out of your prison sentence, much like Russia has done, and still does. It started to do with the ill-fated Wagner, but then was carried on by the Ministry of Defense to a lesser degree for their own assault units. So this has largely failed. And it has to be kept in mind that even while this counterattack was going forward and Russia was dealing with it, they were still continuing with their own offensive, actually to the south of Suja. That continues to have success. They continue to take, a hamlet, a day. This is not a well-populated area. The biggest settlement, right, that the Kiev regime managed to take on their Kursk incursion, Suja, which is, where everything is now centered around, this pocket around Suja, that was only 4,000 to 5,000 people before the conflict. So these are not, and when you don't have that many buildings, it's really hard to make a critical mass of troops because you don't have anywhere to billet them, to protect them. Right?
Yeah, where do you hide?
Yeah, where do you hide? I mean, it's winter. You need, shelter for any considerable amount of time. Yeah. So, but they keep pouring. From what I've heard, reinforcements are really not going to any other area of the front. They're not going to Pokrovsk. They're not going to the Turretsk area. They're not going to the Kupiansk Liman area. They're going just to Kursk, which makes zero sense. Again, except for, they seem to, I mean, Zelensky has invested an incredible amount of political capital. He continues to insist that this Kursk incursion is crucial and that the Kiev regime can't lose it because once the negotiations start in January, they'll trade it back for Russian territory, and they'll impress Trump by the fact that they're still able to hold. I think this is all just absolutely delusional. First of all, there's not going to be any real negotiations that start in January once Trump. I mean, they might start talking, but it's not like things are going to be wrapped up with a ceasefire in a few months. That's not going to happen. Russians have made that clear. So I don't know what's going on in Zelensky's head. I imagine it's pretty twisted.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, I can't think of any other reason short of, I'm going to hold on to this land and we're going to exchange it for Ukrainian territory.
And simply that if they withdrew from it, if they gave up on it, or if they're driven out of it, which they are, just a bit at a time. They've got less than, I would say, around 40% of their original incursion zone less, probably less than 40%. That it will cause probably significant political damage to Zelensky, because this has largely been portrayed as his initiative, right? This is his, the Kursk was his offensive. And there are other forces within the Maidan Milieu, you know, Poroshenko, Klitschko, even Budanov is, you know, hanging on an edge because Zelensky, Budanov is the Kiev regime's sociopathic military intelligence chief. Kirilu, I like the dark Budanov.
Yeah.
Zelensky's powerful gray cardinal chief of staff, Yermak, has been wanting to get rid of Budanov for about a year now. So I imagine that Budanov is politically plotting now with people outside of the Zelensky circle as well, which is not to say that if any of this happened, right, you know, whether Zaluzhny was brought back, you know, whatever happened, that anything would change for the better, right, in the Kiev regime. It would still be the Kiev regime, but I think it might do substantial political damage that might open up avenues for other people within the Maidan regime. Basically
a removal of Zelensky because of how bad this turned out.
It's possible, right? And he has to at least fear the political damage. Whether it would actually result in any change of you know, power, that I still think largely depends on U.S. blessing. But there's also an open question of, once Trump takes office, you know, where does Trump's blessing go in Kiev? I would imagine that if it goes to anyone, it probably won't be Zelensky, right? So I would imagine that some other people will try to present themselves that I can do better for America than Zelensky, right? Because everyone knows that Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He only cares about, well, America, ostensibly, with Trump, right? You know, so they may try to present the whole situation as Zelensky is the problem and I can recover it. But regardless, this has it has not been a success. I still expect more, right? There's too many strikers, too many Abrams tanks provided by Australia, too much ammunition and missiles that the US provided that have not been seen on the battlefield yet, right? And we do have buildup of troops again in the Zaporozhye region and in the Sumy region in the direction of Bryansk. Whether, again, that's enough for a critical mass for another offensive or a real offensive, that's an open question. But I tend to believe that this isn't it. That there's still some more suicidal you know, kick left in them, that they're not done yet.
This is so sad.
You're right that it has been very bad, though, because on top of Karahava being liberated now, which is really important because, one, it was one of these three logistics and supply centers behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines. First, Selidova fell, then now Karahava has fallen, and Pokrovsk is rapidly being encircled, and the battle for Pokrovsk is about to start itself. But also, Karahava was the last real location from which artillery shells could be directed at Donetsk city, which means that for the first time since 2014, Donetsk city had a New Year's, a holiday season without fear of artillery or pedal mines being dropped on them or anything of this sort. This is significant for the people of Donbass. It's for the first. It took that long to push them all out of that artillery range. Now, if they want to waste a HIMARS, theoretically they can still do that, right?
The normal munitions, not so much.
But normal artillery are now completely out of range of the.
Let me ask you this: what about Arestovich? I mean, if Donald Trump is looking for somebody to I don't know, replace Zelensky that seems to be more willing to end the conflict. Arestovich has been pretty loud about this.
He's been pretty loud, but I don't think he has a power base in Kiev to activate. And he would need that. Yeah, he's become too much of a bête noire figure within he's already seen as an outsider. I don't think that's possible. I mean, maybe after the regime is completely overthrown, he could have dreams of coming back, but the Russians remember him too closely to allow that. I think his days are over.
I want to get your take on something else.
One more thing that you mentioned, Karahova, but Toretsk has also fallen, right? Toretsk is now in Russian hands by all reports on the ground. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not announced it yet, and there's still demining, desabotage work, right, to do. And there might be still a few isolated Kiev regime holdouts and basements, and something like that. But the battle for Toretsk, for all intents and purposes, is over. And some of the Russian advanced forces are already moving on to the next target, which is a water reservoir, reaching the banks of a water reservoir to the north, direct north of Toretsk. So Toretsk has also effectively fallen into Russian hands. I would expect the Russian Ministry of Defense will probably officially announce it sometime within the next week, right? They're always very cautious with these things. But Russian reports on the ground, and the only reply the Kiev regime can make is that they're conducting FPV drone attacks on Russian forces who are consolidating the last bits of the city, which is to say they're not there.
Right. Replying something
military bloggers, who are doing the mapping, when you're doing FPV drones attacks on troops in a territory, that's actually in the favor of the troops owning that territory, right? It was in the very north corner of Toretsk. So as far as everyone can tell at this point, the months-long battle for the Toretsk, New York agglomeration is over.
Wow, that is.
And Chasiv Yar is also on its final days as well, I would venture.
They seem to be getting weaker faster, or is it? Am I missing something?
No. They are. I mean, it's still not what most people think of as Hollywood breakthroughs, right? Or the U.S. pushing through non-fighting Iraqi forces in 2000. That's because that's the conception that's burned in people's minds. This isn't this type of war, but for the scope of this conflict, yes. I mean, this is a bleeding operational crisis for the Kiev regime in the southwest Donbass. Russia is going to roll up the rest of the Donbass within 2025, right? By the end of 2025, I expect that all of Donbass will be fully liberated. They seem completely unable to stop, right? They can slow Russian forces down in a few select areas, like they did in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, but even then, it's just a grinding progress for the most part. And once Pokrovsk falls, I mean, you're going to see the Western mainstream media go into another fit of depression and recriminations and finger pointing, because that's really only going to leave one significant defensive line left. That's the Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk defensive line, and that's really important, not just because of it's the final defensive line effectively in the Donbass, but also that's the Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is where the initial uprising in 2014 against the Maidan Putsch started, right? That's where the Donbass, the Russian Spring, as they called it in the Donbass, we don't accept this, the overthrow of the government we elected in Kiev. That's where it started, in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So that it kind of all ends in the Donbass where it began, which is kind of, I guess, poetic, right? If the word poetry and war has any relation. It definitely, in the human experience it does anyway. Which I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing about humanity, but I think you're right that there is a connection between war and poetry in human history. Whether it's warranted or not morally is another question.
Oh yeah, the morality don't play. Yeah, they don't play a part of it. It's just there's a connection between the two.
Yeah. Very bad.
Well, I want to go to Zelensky for a bit, but before I get to Zelensky, he was talking about embezzled money, which I'm fascinated by, that he even admitted it. But there was a conversation, I think it was Alexander McCarris, and he was making this point that Russia doesn't want all of Ukraine, which I agree with, and that at a certain point, there has to be this kind of middle spot where Russia is like, okay, we don't necessarily want to go further, and we don't want to take the pain of going further. By the same token, the West doesn't want Russia to go any further and is willing to make a deal at that point. Meaning there's like a spot on the map where both sides say, okay, we're done.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it that way. I don't think Russia wants all of Ukraine. So yeah, I agree with you.
I absolutely agree with the person that you mentioned in that, certainly that wasn't what the Kremlin wanted when they started this conflict. And it's probably what they still, don't want now, but increasingly I think that there's an understanding that they may have to, that the West is giving them no option, that they're not going to make a deal and divide Ukraine, right? This is not 1945. This is not the Treaty of Westphalia, right? You're not going to see some signed document where, there's some kind of Korean style armistice line drawn. No, I don't think that the West will ever do that. I think that Russia will be forced to continue, and at some point it will be, if we stop, right, all they're going to do is pump as many weapons and arms into whatever is left, and then you're left with, this war first started, I was entirely against the Russian occupation of West Ukraine, because they really do hate Russians there, right? By and large, right? I mean,
which is why I don't think they wanted to take all of it.
They don't want to, but they may have no choice, because anything that they don't take now is just going to be weaponized against them. The entire population there will be just raised as a Western warrior caste to restart the conflict, in a few years as soon as possible by the West, right? They'll be trained. And I think at this point, the terrible costs of a occupation and the resulting guerrilla war in West Ukraine are actually less than the costs of a rump West Ukrainian Banderite statelet that will continue to be weaponized actively against Russia. So, and I think that may be part of the plan. I think part of the U.S. plan, at some level, not their initial plan, but say maybe Plan D or Plan E, is, so the Russians, are just going to keep going. We're not going to give them what they want with some kind of deal that officiates this or admits that we lost here. We'll make them fight for every inch, and let's see them choke on it. That I've actually heard that discussed in some articles in the West, and I think that
I've mentioned it to you. I think I said the same thing to you, that it seems that the objective is let them take it all, and then we have this kind of guerrilla war, like an Operation Gladio in Ukraine. Proper.
Yep. Yeah, I think that may be a fallback plan that is rapidly being, pushed up the chain of possibilities at this point. Because, again, Lvov, Ivano-Frankovsk, Ternopil, these places, this is, it's not Russian-friendly territory, right? It's completely different in the Donbass or, the Kherson and Zaporozhye, where, the majority of the population is either Russian or Russian sympathetic, or at least apathetic to who rules, right? For some of the population that doesn't have a strong national identity conception one way or another. But that becomes less and less the case as you move further west into that Western Ukraine that wasn't even part of Ukraine. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and part of Poland for centuries, briefly part of Poland for centuries, up until the eve of World War II. There's only lesser of bad situations with regards to an end game in Ukraine. There are no good solutions.
Way out. Yeah, that's what I remember when you first came on. I used to ask you, how does this end? Because I don't see how they extricate themselves from it.
It doesn't ever end. It will always, whether it's a frozen conflict, a guerrilla war, or something, there will not be peace in Ukraine for probably the rest of my life and probably the rest of your life too.
Zelensky said something, admitted something that I'm fascinated by. So he said a lot of crazy stuff in this interview, but this very specific part where he's talking about money. Yes, because he's talking about like $170 billion were allocated, and he said we only got half of it. So where's the rest of the money? And he was like, I didn't want to say anything about it because you guys could just stop sending me money, but I could say it now. I want to get your take on this.
During all this time of the war, around 177 billion have been voted for or decided upon. 177 billion. Let's be honest. We have not received half of this money. The second point, which is very important, just as an example, is it corruption? The first question, whose corruption? This is the second.
Okay. This
is just pointing out that go for it. Well, I was just going to say, he's pointing out that all of this money, we only got half of it. The U.S. is putting a lot of the money back into weapons. You guys are forcing me to take the shipments from point A to point B. And he's saying, look, this is corruption. I mean, yeah, Ukraine may have corruption, but this is also corruption in the way that you guys are grifting money off me. Give me your take on this. I mean, because that's a big deal.
This is called deflection and projection, right? And so he's answering a direct question about Kiev regime corruption, right? And he's trying to say, you do corruption too, right? It's deflection. Yes. I mean, there's a whole lot of overhead costs built into the U.S. military-industrial complex that any sane person could identify as corruption. But the U.S. Congress knew when they voted for that $177 billion that they were not going to be handing $177 billion or $170 billion worth of arms directly to Zelensky. That's the way the U.S. military-industrial complex and pork in the U.S. political systems works. Is it corruption? Well, no, it's not corruption when America does it, certainly, right? Okay, so Zelensky may have a little bit of a point there, but he's really just trying to deflecting from Friedman's question on his own. And when 50%, of the arms of some types anyway, that are actually delivered to the Kiev regime, actually delivered to Ukraine, then are disappear onto the global black market. He's trying to deflect away from that.
I thought that number was 70%, if I'm not mistaken. At least what I heard.
At one point it was. I'm trying to be a little
nice.
At one point we heard a 70% number. I'm trying to, be
all inclusive.
I don't do optimism, but I'm trying to be safe, on the conservative level here. So, I mean, that's something that Ukraine needs to consider and factor into the way they do, because Ukraine has been ridiculously corrupt since '91. They never had a Putin that, which is not to say that there isn't corruption in Russia. We've seen a number of Defense Department officials that have ended up in bars during this conflict. But I think one of the most admirable things is that Putin took advantage of this conflict to really root out corruption out of the defense ministry, at least corruption of a significant scale, and to go after figures that had some kind of seniority and some degree of roof or political protection before. So that, is not the case in Ukraine, and it's absurd to even try to compare the level of corruption. This Lex Friedman interview. I mean, Lex Friedman is a thing. I've watched a few of his interviews of other people in the past, and he does not ask critical, probing questions. Right, that's not his style, and certainly none were asked. Zelensky was called on none of his BS. Right, none of his propaganda was he called. But you don't expect that from Lex Friedman. He tries to provide a sympathetic ear to encourage the other people to speak, freely. That's what he does. But I think it's really interesting. So Friedman comes, he's, his family are immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and he speaks fluent Russian. He speaks fluent Russian. So when Zelensky's office officially agreed to this interview, finally, because Friedman's been working to get it for years, he said he actually wrote on social media, Friedman did, that, look it, right, I understand that it's a political thing, but you speak fluent Russian. In fact, you don't speak very good Ukrainian, to be perfectly honest. He didn't say that, right? And I speak fluent Russian. And if we were to do this interview in fluent Russian, right, even with the understanding, it would be a much better interview. We wouldn't have to deal with interpreters. It would be more dynamic. We would understand each other completely. And of course, Zelensky, who speaks, better than me, but he speaks very poor Ukrainian, right?
Because he was
he is a native Russian speaker. His family are native Russian speakers. All of his films, all of his comedy, right, that all occurred in Russian, right? All of his financial success as a comedian, all of his movies, that was all in Russian, that are no longer watchable in Ukraine without dubbing in Ukrainian, by the way, which is hilarious. His own movie, the president's own movies, right? But he struggles often for words in Ukrainian. And even during this, he said no, right? That's the language of the killers. And he said specifically, I have nothing but contempt for the Russian people. Not the Russian Putin, not the Russian government, for the Russian people, the Russian language, the Russian culture, all right, which has all been clear for a long period of time. So he said, no, this has to be conducted in Ukrainian, right? And they did it officially that way. But if you listen to the interview, you don't hear it when you're not a speaker, but he frequently slips into Russian because he doesn't know which Ukrainians to reach for. And he frequently slips into mat, which is foul, bad language, Russian bad language, right? And Russia, right? Like in English, you got like 7 words to curse in, right? 7 words, right? And that's being generous. In Russian, there are entire dictionaries of mat, of bad language. That is much more foul and socially taboo than the 7 words that aren't allowed to appear in some Hollywood movies, right? It's much more socially frowned upon, which not to say that it doesn't happen, but my wife does not want me learning any mat. I'll say that. I'll say that out, frankly. So, but swearing is an art form in Russian. Not it's a skill and an art form, and there are entire dictionaries. No word of lie, no word of exaggeration. There are dictionaries of cursing, of mat in Russian. So he frequently slipped into that, right? And sometimes in English, right? So the interview was actually conducted unofficially in 3 languages, right? Ukrainian officially, right, through a translator. English that Friedman spoke, and that Zelensky tried. He tries to speak English at times, and all the times that they fell into Russian, even though it was not to be held in Russian again, and that's simply because of Zelensky's poor Ukrainian, which it's so funny in this part of the world. It's sad. It's sad, but it puts kind of a human face on the whole idea of this Banderite regime that Zelensky didn't start out as, but has internalized, just as Poroshenko once did,
Right.
and has become this. Again, when 25% of the Ukrainian population was ethnic Russian before this conflict began, and you're taking away their language, their political parties, their media, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because it's not 100% politically loyal to the Kiev regime, all of that. In the West, they try to present the Kiev regime as it's democracy and freedom. It's not.
Right.
It's not any stretch of the imagination. It is a tyrannical, little dictatorial West Ukrainian Banderite regime that is focused on purging, making Ukraine a mono-ethnic, unitary ethnic state on their conception of what it
Right.
means to be Ukrainian, which is not shared, needless to say, by even, more than half of Ukrainians, I would say, but at least half of Ukrainians, right? Who have when they're not ethnic Russian, even when they're Ukrainian, so let's say East Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, they have a completely different national identity conception of what it means to be Ukrainian. And it just doesn't coincide with Banderite fascism. It says that, they're Russians. Yeah, my cousin is Russian. The guy next door is Russian. They're just a brother people. There's a border there now. Why?
So 2000, so all of this started in 2008 then, at the point where the U.S. offered NATO membership, meaning, is that where the friction, ultimately really kicked off?
I think that there has politically within Ukraine, there has always been a degree of friction since 91 between West Ukraine and East Ukraine, right? If you take a look at any voting map in Ukraine, you can see clear geographical differences in every election all the way up through, right? Those political differences are, an extension of social differences, right? That are much more significant than, let's say, voting patterns between the North and the South in the United States. It's much more significant than that. And again, it's not a simple matter of ethnicity. It's not a simple matter of whether you speak primarily Russian or Ukrainian. It's kind of a combination to a degree of all of these things. And it's competing conceptions of Ukrainian national identity conception. I don't want to say it's, Russians v. Ukrainians, because it's not really about that. It's not Russian language versus Ukrainian language speaking. It's not followers of this church against that church or several make-believe churches, or whatever they've come up with. It's more complicated and organic than that, and it's all about Ukrainian history and culture and politics. But yeah, there are some Ukrainians that lean towards Russia, and there are some Ukrainians that lead towards Banderite fascism. And I'll just leave it that way, because I can't even say that they lean Western, because the modern West is not their ideal either, right? Certainly not modern Europe, right? They're anti-LGBT to an even higher degree. Their connection is with the fascist ideologies of the 1930s and 40s. In this case, a particular West Ukrainian, evolved one that existed alongside and, for the most part, cooperated with Nazism in Germany. That's why I don't like to use the term neo-Nazis, right? They're Banderites. It's homegrown. There were homegrown fascists in Croatia, the Ustasi, right, in Slovakia, Romania, even some in Bulgaria. They all had their homegrown fascist ideologies. Well, in Ukraine, it was the right? It's the Banderovtsi. And that banderism is still the undergirding of everything that has happened in Ukraine since 2014 and continues to be.
Wow.
It's the vanguard and the structure underneath. In fact, in 2000, it was either 2017, 2019, I forget the exact date. There was even a Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty article that identified Azov as a neo-Nazi state within a state in Ukraine. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, people, right? You know, in a slightly more honest age, you know, less than a decade ago. So, you know, all of this whitewashing and apologism they've tried to
There are no
use.
Nazis in Ukraine, as they keep saying. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. Before I let you go, one last thing. So Donald Trump has come out and is effective. Well, I guess there are two things. One, Nord Stream. So there is a conversation taking place in the U.S. about buying Nord Stream. Now, I don't know how they would do this, considering
there are also conversations about buying Greenland and taking the Panama.
Well, and that's what I was going to get to. So Trump is now threatening military force to take Greenland and the Panama Canal, and even threatening economic force, as he called it, to take Canada. And the most interesting thing to this is that, you know, Europe made their own bed on this one. If you think about the overthrow of Ukraine, okay, that's a sovereign state being destroyed because they didn't like the politics. They called it a revolution. If you think of what's taking place in Romania, where the courts just killed it because, again, they didn't like the fact of this guy's political framing. If you look at Georgia, where they're trying to overthrow the Georgian government, like in one case after the next, Europe didn't necessarily care about this kind of representative or democratic governments that they didn't like. And now Trump comes in and says, hey, that's a nice Greenland you got there. And it's like, okay, well, what is Europe going to do about it if Donald Trump decides to take it?
Okay, I don't think it's gonna. I don't think it's quite gonna work where the U.S. orders military troops to take Greenland. And I, you know, it's sometimes it's interesting to me on a kind of voyeuristic, you know, train car wreck level to see what ideas get stuck in Donald Trump's mind and how he runs with them. And
it is weird. It's out the blue. Yeah.
And how much of it is real? How much of it is him playing to a persona? I honestly don't know and don't really care.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that at the end of Trump's 4 years, Greenland will. Whether it's a part of Denmark or not is an open question. But whether it's part of the United States, I very much doubt. I also similarly doubt that the U.S. is going, or any U.S. company is going to buy up Nord Stream. And again, they don't. The idea there is to use the existing pipeline network on German territory, not the undersea pipelines, for the purposes of providing easier distribution of U.S. LNG. That is not going to happen. It's not a well thought through. It's somebody's crazy harebrained idea that has been promoted on the front pages because Americans just seem to, you know, think that's a really cool idea for them to take control of the last pipeline that they didn't blow up. But I seriously doubt that is going to happen.
I don't even know how that would work. I mean, it's Russian gas. I mean, how are they going to get U.S. gas through German pipe? Yeah, I don't get that one. I never understood that one. That's why I was asking. I didn't see how that was going to work.
It's again, they don't want the pipeline underneath the Baltic. That's not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about the onshore piping distribution. Again, and here's the thing. The company that built and owns Nord Stream is not just Russian, right?
Right.
And it's not just Russian German. It's actually a consortium of European energy majors. The French were involved in that. The British, the Italians, the Germans, right there. This was a consortium where they all had, shares invested in this big pipeline. And the idea is that they would use part of the existing network that is on German land territory to make easier the distribution of U.S. provided LNG once it's transferred back into a gaseous form, but it's not really that useful or possible or capable. It's a very harebrained idea as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm not an oil or gas export in this case, but from what I've read, it's not serious.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know how Trump comes up with this stuff. It wasn't something he brought up during the election. It just came out of nowhere, and he just stuck on it at that point.
This is the thing about Trump, is sometimes it seems to me anyway, that the most important thing is who talked to him 15 minutes ago and managed to stuck an idea in his head. Let's be generous and say he is mercurial and quixotic that way.
2 minutes. One more thing. 2 minutes. Is there any pathway you see to this ending short of Russia taking the whole territory? Meaning, if Trump could sit down, or somebody sits down and they have a conversation, and Russia says, "I want this, and this will be okay. We will be perfectly okay with this to end it without us taking all of it." What would that be? Or does that even exist?
There will be no deal, no signed papers between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. It's not
just
going
to be
to
on the battlefield. Yeah,
it's going to be on. Now, there are other possibilities that I see no avenue for right now. If there is some type of internal political regime change in Kiev and someone who wants to end the war comes to power and then is somehow officiated in such a way as to legitimately represent the state of Ukraine, which, remember, Russia right now doesn't even recognize Zelensky as capable of signing any papers legally, right? He can sign them, but he's not legally the president as far as they're concerned. And he could sign it and it would mean nothing to the next, the future of, a Ukrainian state's, politicians, right? So they would feel no compulsion. So, how can that end? And
yeah,
these are all what if scenarios, right? That have no clear avenue of how they would happen right now, because the real political opposition in Ukraine was banned and has been lustrated and pogromed and driven out of the country. The leader of the largest real opposition party in Ukraine, right? The opposition bloc, he was captured and traded to Russia in a prisoner of war exchange. A Ukrainian citizen, Viktor Medvedchuk, right?
I remember that. Yeah, I remember him.
Yes. I mean, yes, he certainly doesn't agree with the Maidan or everything that happened since, but he represented politically, right? Eastern Ukraine to a very significant degree, right? We can talk about, yes, lesser of two evils. That's democracy everywhere. He certainly wasn't a perfect candidate for anyone, but he represented the views of essentially half of Ukraine. And he was, those views, right, are no longer politically acceptable in Ukraine, right? There can be no revisiting of the Maidan geopolitical flipping of Ukraine that occurred in 2014. So all political parties, media, anyone who might suggest having a anti-Russian foreign policy is forbidden, right? It cannot be allowed to happen, right? It doesn't even have to be a pro-Russian, but simply a non-rabidly anti-Russian foreign policy. That can't be allowed.
Neutral doesn't exist. Yeah. It is. Wow.
That is why I believe one of the many reasons that this regime is just going to have to be rooted out, root and branch from Kiev and probably further west as well, that there can't be any coexistence, and that between it and Russia, and that there will be no peace of any sort in Ukraine until it's removed from this cancer is driven completely from the Ukrainian body politic.
How would that work, though? Would that mean they would have to put in a puppet government?
Oh, sure.
Puppet election?
Puppet government. They would do in reverse everything that the Maidan has done since 2014, right? All the Maidan parties would be banned. all of the officials who ever served in the Maidan government would be lustrated. They could never serve office again. All of the media outlets, that put out pro-Maidan would be banned. Western NGOs that fund them.
Jesus
Basically, everything that the Maidan regime did since
That's a heavy lift, Mark.
2014 will have to be done in reverse, right? Which, as far as I'm concerned, it's quid pro quo now, right? You did it, and you portrayed it as freedom and democracy when you did it, right? Because it was pro-Russian, right? Like half of Ukraine. But of course, it will be called tyranny and Russian military occupation when it happens the other way around. But do we really care about the perception in the Western media anymore? No, we don't.
No,
we don't.
Yeah.
And again, having extensive, my wife is Crimean. We have family in Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa, all over East Ukraine. The people of East Ukraine don't give two figs what Americans think
I can imagine,
about how, what is going to happen in post.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even consider ethnic Russian Ukrainians. I mean, at a certain point, we didn't even, that wasn't even part of our media space. Mark, man, thank you for this, Mark. I always appreciate the explanation of what takes place. And again, as I point to my audience, you tend to be more right on this stuff over the past several years than anybody else. So,
and I hope every day that I'm wrong.
Yeah, but you don't tend to be. So there's that part. Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1. You can also, there we are. You can also find him on his YouTube channel at Real Politic with Mark Sloboda and on Facebook.com/Gramsci, the voice of reason and reality, Mark Sloboda. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Always appreciate Mark. Like you said, he always hopes that he's wrong, but usually he is not. And the Zelensky thing is fascinating because, early on when we were having these interviews, I used to ask, okay, how does this end? It's one thing to get yourself into something. How do you extricate yourself from it? Because all things being equal, if you're going to extricate yourself from it, you want to extricate yourself from it in a way where you're not continuously fighting. Or at the very least, you're not going to get into a situation where in 5 years, you're going to have to make another heavy lift to do what you've done and invested blood and treasure in to do again. And so how do you end this without it being continuously, let's say, against you as you move forward into the future? And I couldn't quite figure out how that works. The U.S., look, it's one thing if my country goes to war and I, as a political leader of that country, is making certain decisions about the best interests of my country, and for that matter, the best interests of my military. Okay, that's one thing. You have a responsibility to your military in that situation. You have responsibility to the people who are putting on that uniform that you're going to look out for the best interests of them and the best interests of the country. And if it gets to a point where it comes across as, I cannot get anything else from this war, and my people are dying in mass, I don't want the military to collapse, and I need to take the interests of them in mind. Okay, that's one thing. You have a relationship with it. What does it mean, though, when you have no relationship with the people who are out there fighting? Meaning, I am driving a car that I don't own. I am using an instrument that I don't own. That's not mine. Now, some people would say, well, I want to take better care of it. Other people would say, I don't care because it's not mine. From the U.S. point of view, we are using effectively someone else's military to accomplish an objective. And the fact that that military is being fundamentally destroyed on the battlefield, where these people are losing their lives for something that at this point is somewhat unclear, even to the point where they're sending in kids. Now, understand, they're doing this knowing full well that Donald Trump is coming in saying, I'm going to end the war. Nobody wants to be the last one to die in a losing war that the next guy is going to somehow close, which is why you have all of these people deserting in one sense, but also those people know that they're out there dying in another. Not to mention you're seeing videos and pictures of them ripping people and throwing them in vans and beating people up. Like, this is stuff that you're seeing. My point is very straightforward. The U.S. is using an instrument that it doesn't own, and so it doesn't necessarily care that the instrument is being broken. And if from the US perspective, all of Ukraine is taken, meaning we want to stick it to the Russians, we want to punish the Russians. Okay, fair enough. That is not signing a deal. That is allowing the Ukrainian military to be broken, forcing Russia to take it all, and then fighting this kind of Operation Gladio guerrilla war, where you can effectively try to bleed them dry by making them choke on the thing to which they swallowed. In chess, they call it a poison pill or poison pawn. It's the thing that you take that you can't necessarily, if that makes sense. That is Mark's point. And that was kind of the thought that I had a while ago when we were talking about this war, that the moment that you stop, they build up forces in order to do it again. The moment that you stop, they build up forces in order to do it again. And so it's like, how do you stop when you know that that's what they're going to do? And so between stopping and allowing forces to build up on your border where they can have another incursion or continue this kind of fight, it may be a better option, as bad as the option is, to swallow it whole and deal with the guerrilla war. I don't know. There are no good options. I think it's the main point. I'm going to go to my guest, though. We are joined, the man himself, the man of the hour, Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist, syndicated columnist, and the host of TMI, Too Much Information, with the one, the only, the great Manila Chan, from 10 to 12, every day, Monday through Friday. Ted, man, how you doing this morning? You doing all right?
I'm good. I had my eye burned yesterday on purpose, so it was good.
You say your eye burned on purpose? What do you mean?
I had a growth on my eyelid. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, like one of these things, like, you know, sort of like anyway. It's been there for years, and it was like yesterday was the day. It's like, there's not room in here for the two of us. You've got to go. So, so they take this very, they burn it off. They cauterize it. So they use a tiny little hot poker, and there's like,
Yeah.
And anyway, it's kind of like, it, you know, it's your eye, and it's really hot, so, you know, it's not that comfortable, but it's like a spite thing where you're like, yeah, that's right, it hurts, get out, because he's like an invading force. It's like a body snatcher. It's like, why are you here? Get off my eye.
It's amazing. So much stuff associated with the physical body. I mean, like, and you have to think all that stuff has to work right, otherwise something goes wrong. And I know this sounds funny, but if you think of like all of these little, like if you're building software, you have all of these little programs. And you may have this massive software application, but you may have like a million different sub algorithms that are basically running. And if any of those things go wrong, something is going to be screwed up. And the body is very similar. Like you can have one cell that's doing something that becomes cancerous that starts taking over other cells. And you're like, you know, it's so complicated. Like like that's the religious argument, right? Like it's hard to fathom that atoms will cobble together to make a cell, that will cobble together to make a tissue, like an organ, that will cobble together to make, you know, and it's like all of these little subsets, and then it grows into this bigger thing. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around that.
Totally.
And how that would happen. But again, over the span of the universe, I suppose, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It also kind of belies intelligent design.
Yes. Yeah. It does. Know, I mean, and I know some people may say
order in the universe. I'm like, where do you see order in the universe?
People. I mean, I don't know. That gets into a religious argument. I'm not Christian or anything like that, but I think there is something, like even getting into esoteric studies, like if you're like OBEs or remote viewing or stuff like that, that stuff is fascinating.
Totally.
And it gets across, there's something there, you know, even if I don't know what it is, I can put my finger on it. Speaking of something there, that's a bad transition, but fair enough, I'll go with it. Donald Trump is really talking about this 51st state stuff and is threatening Canada with economic force. So I want to go to two clips. The first clip is where he's talking
threatening
about
military force against Greenland.
Panama, yes. Effectively saying Greenland and Panama needs to come under U.S. control. So let's go to this one first. I think this is the Greenland one. All right. I am astonished by this because I don't know what he's getting at here. And, you know, on some level, as I keep pointing out, Europe brought the stuff on themselves. This is Trump. And I believe this is the one where he's talking about Greenland.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time. You have approximately 45,000 people there. People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world. You look at, you don't even need binoculars. You look outside, you have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place. We're not letting that happen. We're not letting it happen.
Not letting what happen? I mean, what is like? What do you mean not letting what happen? What is happening right now? I don't know what's happening. And then he's like, I mean, I get it, right? He's making this kind of military argument, and then to say we're doing it for the free world. You should give us Greenland for the free world. Hey, you should give us Canada because I'm representing and fighting for the free world. What a ludicrous argument to make! But that is the argument Europe is making in Ukraine, right? We are doing this because if Putin doesn't do it, he's going to take it all. We're fighting in Ukraine for the free world. That argument is outrageous and saying they should just give it to us because of it. What? I mean, this was not something that was brought up during the election. This just came out of the blue. What do you think he's doing here? Is this deflection? Is this? I don't know how to place this. Give me your thoughts on this, Ted.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump talks a lot of crap, right? So whoever knows if this is that or not. I mean, you look, the Ukraine argument, which I have never bought, but at least it's a coherent argument, which is it's kind of analogous to it's the we've got to fight them there, we're going to fight them further west,
right?
Argument. It's like give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Next thing you know, they're going to be in Prague. Okay, I mean, I understand the argument. I don't buy it, but there's no evidence to support it. But okay, I mean, it makes sense anyway. This is a typical Trumpian kind of like, you fill in the blanks because he's not going to provide you with the details. He's going to use a lot of vague stuff. Like when you're dealing with someone who's kind of like a little, kind of a little loopy, and you're trying to like make sense for them. And he knows he's doing that. He's not stupid. He's doing that to like, well, do it for the free world. And it's like, so you're like, well, what does he mean by that? So does he mean that the American Navy needs to be able to pass through what will be the Northwest Passage after the ice cap is gone 365 days a year? Is that what he means? I mean, I'm think that's where I go, right? But other people would go elsewhere. He talks about the Chinese and Russian ships. Russia already has the domination over the Arctic because of their geography. I mean, They have all the ports in Siberia, right? I mean, you just look at a map of the North Pole and you'll just, like Russia, this is Russia's like to lose, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like, okay, I don't know what he's talking about. Like they don't need Greenland. So it's like, and then the whole like, well, we need it. We don't know if Denmark has no one knows if Denmark has a legal claim. Well, I think the UN knows that Denmark has a legal claim. Yeah. I think the Greenlanders know that Denmark has a legal claim.
It's like, I don't even know if they own it.
It's a colony, So is Puerto Rico. So is Hawaii, right? I mean, so is California.
Yeah. It's like, I don't even know if they own it. I don't, who knows if they own it? It's only a few thousand people there. We need it. We're not going to let them do it. It's like, let them do what? What are they doing?
And Denmark's not part of the free world? What did they ever do?
It's so weird. It's just so out the blue. Well, I think what it tells us though is this notion of American invincibility is a myth, and he knows it. Like I could never expect, no one would have ever intended 20 years ago that an American president would come out and say, we're going to take Greenland and Canada. Like, it's just outlandish. On some level.
Exciting. It's undeniably exciting, right? I mean,
yeah.
Jamarl, I'm older than you, but when I was a kid in school, and I'm sure you had this experience too, when you learned why are there 50 stars on the flag, right? It's like, so it's like one for each state. Every time they added a new state, and you saw the old flags and all the different configurations. And I remember being a kid. I'm born in 1963, so the last state was only 3 years before I was born. So I remember,
Really?
and I remember thinking like, oh, so like there could be, how would they do the 51 state flag? For throughout when I was a little kid, there was a lot of thought Puerto Rico would end up becoming the 51st state, or maybe DC in the 80s. And so, it wasn't really outlandish at the time. It was like, well, throughout our whole history, for almost 250 years next year, we've been expansionist, and so it's kind of like, but that stopped in 1960, and there's been, so we don't amend the Constitution anymore. We don't add any more stars to the flag. We don't expand, and it's like, well, and so there's the sense like we're kind of like Europe now. We're like stopped. I'm fine with it, but I think that it's part of national mythology. This taps into something that is really fundamentally American. Maybe it's really white American. It's certain kind of white American. But
but that goes back to like this colonial stuff, right? Where you're just taking countries. It seems like we got to a certain point on the global stage where we realize, hey, stealing countries is not necessarily a good thing, especially when the people don't want you to do it. And so we have this kind of what we consider
profitable.
I think we consider it to be civilization. Like it's a civilized way of engaging. And so to turn around and say, we're going to take Greenland, or we're going to take Canada. And then he even points out, he says, no, we don't have a right to it. But, so what? Like right here, when they ask him, the reporter's like, well, why do you have a right to it? And his response is like, well, I didn't say we had a right to it. Just saying we want it.
Well, that's frankly, he's being more honest. That's true about every inch of land that is in the United States today. It was never ours.
Yes.
We just took it.
Yes.
All of it.
It's
I
accept the honesty.
Israel has the right to exist. No country has a right to exist. It's like a country exists if it can take territory and hold it. That's it.
Right. It's a muscular issue. It's the power. It's not, which goes to the whole thing of Europe, right? It's like, what is Denmark going to do if Donald Trump decides to take it? This is him. I think they ask him about Canada in this clip. And listen to what he says. I'm like, he is pulling this out of his ass. And I guess my thing is, it's like, you didn't bring this up over any point in the election. And now all of a sudden you're about Greenland to Canada.
Right. Good point.
Considering military force to acquire Panama and Greenland, are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Panama?
No, economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada. But here's the problem with Canada. So many friends up there. I love the Canadian people. They're great. But we're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada. We lose in trade deficits. We're losing massive. We don't need their cars. They make.
And then he goes for another several minutes trashing Canada, saying, oh, we protect them militarily, and they're taking advantage of us, and we don't need their cars, we don't need their wheat, we don't need their whatever. And he spends like minutes just trashing Canada, saying, hey man, we shouldn't have to protect them at all. Why are we doing this? Why do we have a trade deficit? We shouldn't take anything from them if they don't want to join us as a 51st state.
I don't know what he's talking about. We need them for national security. I never thought of Canada as our soft northern flank. It's like they're coming in that way. Like, I don't really think so. Whoever they are. But also, my favorite part here is the artificial line. This is a man who's literally president-elect of the United States because of an artificial line on the southern border, right? And it's like, well, that's important. We can't have anyone come over that border at all, or if we do, we have to control it really much more rigidly. This is like, well, if that's an artificial, if 5440 or fight is an artificial border, then so is clearly the U.S.-Mexico border, which is not even, which we stole through several wars.
Right.
It's like, what? What is he talking about?
All lines are artificial by definition. States are just legal fictions. But you're right. If you're going to make that,
and
right. Right. If you acknowledge it for one, on some level, you're stuck with acknowledging for the
By
other.
the way,
But
just parenthetically, I would think that Canada would really be like each province would probably become a state, but
Mhm.
you know,
well, he's an entire state. I think he called Trudeau Governor Trudeau, jabbing him with the first state. And then he makes this other thing where he talks about Trudeau coming to Mar-a-Lago, and that Trudeau was crying at Mar-a-Lago when Trump said he was going to put sanctions on Canada. Like, this stuff is just outrageous. I guess my thing is, why is he saying this? Why is he doing this? Like, why is this all of a sudden his focal point? Donald Trump got in and said he's going to end the war. And then the moment that he gets elected, this nonsense comes up. Why not say this a year ago? Why not say this 6 months ago? Like, meaning, why is he bringing in Canada, Greenland, and Panama Canal now? It's very bizarre.
Nobody knows what goes on between that left ear and the right ear of Donald Trump. But I mean, speculating, I think this all really goes to Panama. The Panama Canal has had to throttle their traffic because of the drought, and they've had a shortage of, as you know, they can't send as many ships through there, so they've been increasing the passage fees. I think that's when Trump started. Someone briefed him on that. And then he started to get annoyed that the United States was going to have, sort of higher shipping and, costs through the Panama Canal. And that got him thinking about all these other things. Like, why'd we ever give that away anyway? Also, Panama Canal's in the news because of the death of Jimmy Carter, who signed the Panama Canal Treaty. So I think that kind of like got him going, and got him thinking about these things. Donald Trump knows that, like, he's not running a political party or a presidency. He runs a movement, and a movement has to be exciting. A movement has to always make news, even if it's dumb news. But it's like something that's going to get the cameras there and people like us to say, "Holy crap! What the hell is going on?" That's exactly what Donald Trump wants and needs, and he's not wrong. I mean, just think about how. Like, we basically, under Joe Biden, for 4 years, we haven't really had a president at all. And then, and it's been boring as hell, right? I mean, it's been like, there's a sense of no one at the helm. Well, you don't really have a sense that this is leadership, but man, as the band, The Jam said, that's entertainment,
It is entertainment. I guess I just wish it was galvanized to something that mattered. Like,
right.
It's one thing if you say, I'm going to pass Medicare for all. And it becomes this big thing. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something big. I'm going to do something bold. I'm going to do something and bring people in and make.
I'm going to eliminate homelessness.
I'm going to eliminate homelessness. Again, another one, right? This is what we're going to do
for everyone.
Something big, bold, something that is like a shining city on a hill type thing. This is nonsense. I mean, yes. Can he militarily take Greenland? Yeah, I'm pretty sure the U.S. military that we spend $1 trillion can take Greenland. Europe can't do anything about it one way or the other. Even if all of Europe military got involved, they couldn't do anything.
But it's a part of NATO, so we would have to defend Greenland against ourselves under our Article 5 treaty obligation.
I guess this is how sad Europe has gotten. I mean, and this goes to this. Somebody on Twitter pointed out this is the year of humiliation for Europe. And that Europe effectively has allowed itself to be put into this kind of humiliating spot. If you think about it, we effectively defend Europe. Europe can't do anything without the U.S. say so. Even Zelensky, when Zelensky was having a conversation with Les Friedman, and he points out, Europe looks at us and we look at America. Why? Because at the end of the day, we're going to be the ones who make the choice one way or the other about whether or not there's a deal in Ukraine, not Europe. Russia doesn't even talk to Europe at this point because there's no reason to. Like, they are effectively a vassal state. They're an occupied territory. Even if you look at the gas, what did Trump do? Trump came out and says, you're going to buy more LNG from us or else. Okay, now think about that for a moment. We blow up their pipeline. We sell them energy 5 times more than what they were paying for prior, meaning they now have to spend 5 times more for energy from us after we blow up their pipeline. They can never own it and say that the U.S. blew up the pipeline, so they blame Ukraine. So on top of sending Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars, meaning Europe, they now have to pay energy costs 5 times more because of the pipeline that they're claiming that Ukraine blew up. And to make it even worse, Ukraine decides you are no longer going to get energy through our transit. So now you're going to have to pay even more money for energy. And Donald Trump is telling them, well, you need to buy it from us or else. Think of how ridiculous of a position that these world leaders in Europe have allowed themselves to be in. And so for Trump looks at it as, well, if they're pushovers for this, why wouldn't they be pushovers for Denmark or for Greenland? Why not? What can they do about it? They're a pushover for everything else. Meaning they've allowed themselves to be in this kind of vassal, weak position where it's as if they don't have a foreign policy of their own that works in their own interests. It's utterly bizarre.
Well, you're 100% right, Jamarl. And what really brings it home to me is thinking about the origins of the EU. Well, of course, the idea was originally Hitler's. People forget that. But like the idea of the modern EU, which emerged in the late 70s, under the Brussels Pact and all that stuff, and then emerged under the first EU, which was sort of run by France and Germany together, and then spread. I mean, that EU was the whole purpose of it, right? It was sold to the Europeans as and I remember this because I voted in that election. I'm a French national, so I voted against the EU, by the way, in favor of French sovereignty. And the point is that they said they said, well, we have to be able to take on the United States as a hegemon, an economic and political hegemon. In at least in France, I mean, every European country has its own story, but in France, this is like the DNA of it goes back to Charles de Gaulle kicking NATO out of Paris, which is why it's in Brussels. We were a great power before World War II. Just because our American friends helped us in World War II does not mean we should be their dog forever. Right. So, we're France, we have greatness. Germany, we have greatness. Spain, we have greatness. So the idea was we're going to pull it all together. We're going to be as big or a bigger trading bloc and a military union eventually, maybe a political union as well, against the United States. This was supposed to be an anti-American project. Now, the practical effect of it has become, in short order, the Americans are not only still running the show, but it's actually easier for them because now, instead of having to call around and push the Czechs around and the Romanians around and so on, they just make one phone call, right? It's it's easier. It's to be just this is Big Don, take care of it. And he is rolling like a Don, right? I mean, that's his thing. This is gangster, right? Do what I say, and or else. And and give me more money or else. That's all it's about. And Americans love it because they've seen the movies. They appreciate it. They kind of feel maybe not all Americans. I don't appreciate it. I think we're just one country out of 200. But they're like, well, we're the biggest, baddest country. We were all taught that in school. We should get all the toys. That's the thinking.
It is deeply humiliating. It's shockingly humiliating for Europe in this situation. Think for example, the war, the Syrian war. We decide under Obama that we want to overthrow the Syrian government. You got all of these people streaming out of Syria and ending up going into Europe. This ends up destabilizing the politics of all of these countries, where these countries trend a hard right because they are responding to this kind of immigration influx, which screws up the politics of Europe. Now, Europeans don't look at this and say, okay, well, America screwed up our politics. We have all of these people coming into the country because of the wars that America is involved in. Europe doesn't say that. They keep their mouth shut. They just take them in and accept the damage from it. This war with Ukraine, again, the energy reserves, something that Europe needs. I mean, the pipelines and everything else. Energy is expensive in Europe because, for the most part, they're not making their own in the way that America is making their own, or in some of the Muslim countries, or I should say the Middle East. And yet, they allowed the U.S. to get them to pass sanctions to eliminate the oil that they were able to get from Russia that was inexpensive. Now, the truth is, they were still getting it from Russia, but they were paying a markup going through Saudi Arabia. I guess my point is they allowed all of this to take place. And now Trump, either with Canada or with Europe, is now telling them, I need you to spend more money on NATO. I need you to go up 5%. Now, they weren't even paying 2%. He's now saying 5% because what Trump knows is that when they spend that money, the money that they're spending, 70% of it is coming to us to buy our weapons.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
What the hell? Like, do you think that at some point they get a backbone? They say, okay, this is too much. Like even us, even we at this lowly spot have some sort of backbone. We have some dignity in ourselves. You can't push us around like this. Because at this point, it seems like they're perfectly okay being pushed around. This is humiliating, especially, and not just humiliating, damaging to the people in Europe. Like, think of the businesses that are leaving Europe because they can't afford the energy costs. Or think of the salaries that might be going down because they can't, because of the businesses that are closing up. There's a reason that these political parties are going to the right. There's a reason that Schultz is going to lose, or Macron lost all of those races, or at the very least his party lost all those races. There's a reason for that stuff. Give me your take on that. You as a French citizen, like you were pointing out, well, not French citizen, but I know what you mean. You voted in an election. How do they see it? Like, because I never understood why Europe was okay with it. And maybe you can tell me why they're okay with it.
Well, I mean, I know more about France because of my family association with the French, and I've been there a lot more than other European countries, which I have been to, but many others, but certainly France. Look, I don't think everybody's okay with it. I think a lot of Frenchmen are not okay with it at all. Jean-Marie Le Pen, right, the founder of the National Front, which became the National Rally under Marine Le Pen. He just died a couple of days ago, 96 years old, and
they celebrated it in France. Did you see that?
Pardon?
They celebrated it in France. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the French people really did pull together against him when he made it to the first round in the presidential election. Now, the thing is, though, I thought it was super interesting that his death took place at this particular moment in history. And I think Marine Le Pen is the person to watch in Western Europe now as a bulwark against not just Trumpism, but really just like the American, hegemonic influence over Western Europe. She will likely be president of France in 2 years. And when that happens, I think you're going to see a big pushback. She represents French nationalism, old school, like 1950s style, like, hey, thanks for your help on D-Day. Bye. We don't need you. And I think if you see that example succeed in France, it's going to spread to other Western European countries, not least of which would probably be Italy and Germany. And it's going to be a big deal. I think the resentments have been building for a long, long time, and Trump could end up pushing this. It's one thing to be the dog; it's another thing to be called the dog. And like they're Trump's rubbing their noses in it, and it's like I think a lot of Europeans are really not satisfied with the sort of the post 70s technocratic leadership model that we've seen there. I mean, basically, just it's like basically it's just like Mitt Romney's running the whole continent. It's just it kind of just sucks, and so I don't think it'll last. I mean, no, Europeans are they know their history. They have their histories are many times longer and richer than ours. They're nuclear powers, many of them. They don't need to take this, right? I mean, they shouldn't. They don't have to, and they're doing it by choice, as you say.
Trump is treating him like Chris Christie. Do you remember when Chris Christie was standing behind Trump, and they were making all of these memes of Chris Christie's face because he just stood there for 15 minutes as Trump spoke, and the way he used to say, "All right, Christie, go ahead," like he would like fan him away. I mean, he treated Chris Christie like he was a servant or something. That is the way we treat them. Yep. That is the way we treat them, and for all intents and purposes, they accept it. Like somebody called it the year of humiliation, and I think they're right. I want to go to this clip by The View. This is my guilty pleasure, and I want you to hear them talking about January 6th, because they're making this case that January 6th is up there in importance of Pearl Harbor, of the Holocaust, of I want to get your take on it. They put in the Holocaust as this is the level to which January 6th exists. I want to get your take on this clip. I mean, the stuff that they say on The View is fascinating to me.
we need to find moral clarity, in this country. And I just remember after January 6th, you had someone like Mitch McConnell placing the blame on January 6th where it belonged, squarely on Donald Trump's shoulders. And then you started seeing people backtrack that and losing their moral center. You had Condoleezza Rice, I believe, on this very show saying, we need to move on from January 6th. I say no. You don't move on, because January 6th was an atrocity. It was one of the worst moments in American history. And when you think about the worst moments in American history,
Just to pause for a bit, keep in mind, she's saying this when she voted for a person who was committing an atrocity in regards to the genocide taking place in Gaza, meaning Biden, Harris are presiding over what all of these organizations, pretty much every organization, human rights organization, has come out saying is a clear genocide. The International Criminal Court has put an arrest warrant out for Gallant and Netanyahu. The ICJ is calling this a genocide, meaning all the way down the line, all of these groups are saying this is a clear genocide that the U.S. government, Israel, is effectively presiding over. I'm saying the U.S. government because we paid 70% of everything that is taking place. They couldn't do it without us. She was fine backing a candidate that was backing a genocide. That is an atrocity. January 6th is something else. Meaning, I get January 6th is bad. Don't call it the Holocaust. Don't tell me it's equivalent to a genocide that's taken place where 40, 50,000 people have lost their lives, or these rape camps and everything else that's taken place in these prisons. Don't tell me that and act like these things are somehow simultaneous, because the fact of the matter is she's not complaining about that or that her candidate is backing that stuff. She's complaining about January 6th, which, as bad as it was, it's not a Holocaust. It's not an atrocity. It was a riot. There was more. In fact, there's more to this clip. I'm sorry. The things that they say are just sometimes outrageous to me. I'll let it finish.
Like World War II, things that happened, like the Holocaust, chattel slavery. We need to never forget, because past becomes prologue if you forget any race. I want to ask you, I think we need to find...
According to her, January 6th is like chattel slavery. It's like chattel slavery, not just slavery, chattel slavery. Wow. Not just the very specific American brand of slavery. That's what January 6th is like, and the Holocaust. So January 6th is like, what, 10 million Jews being put into camps and tortured and everything else, let alone the other, 40 million Russians or 30 million Russians that was involved? Like, this is outrageous.
Yeah. January 6th is a riot. It's a low moment. It's a bad look. There's a lot of other, I would say, lower moments in, that even compare. I would say the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago would be a worse moment than January 6th by far, right? I would say the assassination of JFK was a lower moment by far. I think it's escaping me right now. The was it Lincoln, Nebraska, that had the
school shooting?
Right. 100 years ago, right, where they burned down and massacred a bunch of black people in a.
I was thinking the riots at the Arkansas campus or some campus where there's a famous iconic picture with the woman laying over her body and she's
Kent State.
Kent State, thank you.
Yeah, Kent State. Yeah. I mean, 4 dead in Ohio, right? That's more than died on January 6th. So and it's far worse because it was on purpose. I mean, it was like it wasn't like a thing that got out of control. The governor told the National Guard to kill some students, and they did. So I mean, I'm just saying there's like it's insane. But I mean, the thing is, the voters have been very clear here. Don't let go of January 6th. She's blaming Condoleezza Rice. It's like, I'm not a fan of Condoleezza Rice, but Condoleezza Rice is right tactically from the standpoint of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. No one cares about January 6th anymore. The voters made that very clear in November. It's not important to them. It's not, and I don't really think it should be important. We have bigger issues, as you mentioned. Our support for Israel against the people of Gaza. That's a great example of a far more important issue. I could enumerate them. We all know what they are. It's just that, this is something that happened 4 years ago. It's, not a great look. Maybe shore up the security a little better next time you count the votes and leave it at that, right? I mean, it is, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, this is like militant Democrats gone wild kind of.
It is.
And they're living in their own echo chamber. It's not unlike watching Fox, except, on the other side. And basically they stir themselves up over, reminds me when Republicans were going crazy over Benghazi. It's like, why does no one care about Benghazi? Because no one cares about Benghazi. Should they?
Right.
Maybe, but they don't. And it's like, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, you go to an election with the electorate you have, not the electorate you wish you had. And the electorate that you have does not care about January 6th. And maybe they should, but they don't. Let it go.
So true. God, man, so true. I mean, it tells, I often say what you say often says more about you than it does anybody else. And the fact that they're so harping on this, look, I get it, right? You had a riot at the Capitol that was trying to prevent a candidate from ascending to power, effectively recertifying the election. Again, fair enough. I totally get it. It is shocking, especially when it's kind of a Democratic leader. But this is something that they have latched onto. And they have spent so much time screeching and screaming about January 6th. I think the thing is, this is a Democratic issue. And I think you're right. This is something that they've latched onto, like Republicans had latched on to Benghazi. It's like, yeah, it's important, but, should it really subsume everything else that you're effectively thinking about? And Democrats spent 3 years banging on this particular drum about January 6th, Donald Trump, he's going to be a threat to democracy, all of that stuff. And the public still voted for Trump. Carville seems to be, at the very least, trying to get his head on right. And Carville, listen to what Carville said, because I think Carville is right here. And he's kind of echoing a bit what you just said, dude, leave it and move on to other more important issues. This is Carville. If I can get to him, there we are.
I'd say, bro, first of all, I totally agree with that person. It's very depressing. But if you're doing political strategy, if you have an airplane crash, you got to go back and find out what went wrong. You don't say, well, let's just forget about it and move on. No, it was the flap set in the right setting, or, was there something that the pilot didn't pay to? I don't know, but it is sort of depressing. But, Michael, there's a simple basic rule of politics is voters want an election about them. They don't want an election about you or your opponent. And for too much, we lost that. I lost it myself. We made it about Trump, and we didn't make it about voters. And it's never a good idea. And how could I, at 80 years old, been doing this for 50 years, lapse into that level of stupidity? I got to ask myself. And
Jamarl, you're muted.
That is fascinating. Oh, there we are. That is fascinating. Because Carville is effectively like, I got sucked into an echo chamber. And, we made the election about something wrong about Trump. We should have been making it about voters. I myself got worked up into that. We need to have an autopsy. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, he's right.
He's totally right. I mean, he's undeniably right. And I just want to parenthetically say that it's awesome that his backdrop is his bar as opposed to the books that he supposedly read. But I'm like, I want to know what he's got back there. I don't agree with his politics, but he's too far to the right for me. But I do like James Carville as a person. And he is right. I mean, obviously he's right. Yeah, I mean, you can get obsessed over something and just be like, well, I mean, we've all done it in our personal lives and at work.
Of course.
But it's like, at a certain point, it is what it is, right? And it's, and I always want to, by the way, just as a parenthetical for J6, if that had worked, that was not going to make Donald Trump president.
Right.
It was like a childish, kind of mini riot, micro riot, right? Like this sort of if they had gone in there and somehow banged Nancy Pelosi's head on the desk and been like, you gotta like certify the vote for the Donald instead. And let's just say they had, that doesn't make him, it's not like, hitting that one spot on the Death Star that makes the whole thing blow up. It doesn't work that way.
It would have never worked.
It's not a revolution. It's not, in other words, it's not even an attempted revolution, because had this actually worked, nothing would have changed.
Yeah, you might have hung Mike Pence, but that wouldn't have stopped, that wouldn't have stopped Joe Biden from taking office. I agree with you. And look, Carville is far to the right, fair enough. But I think Carville, more than anything else, wants to win. And I've heard him say before, right? He says, look, elections are not about making people feel good. Elections are about winning. And in winning, there's certain policies that you go with that tries to pull the public. Meaning, I think he said one day, there's some people who are okay losing if they can be moral in their loss. Like this kind of, well, I lost, but at least I fought the good fight. He was like, that is not of what elections are about. Elections are about winning and then affecting policy. None of this, feeling good about losing nonsense. So of anybody, weirdly enough, he seems to be the one that seems to be like, we need to make a change. Something needs to be different. Something is not working right in the way that we're thinking about this stuff. We made this too much about Donald Trump when really we should have been making it about voters. Thank you, Carville. I appreciate that.
And we made it about, and they made it also about their first Joe Biden, never mind that he's so old, and then about Kamala Harris. Look how cool it is that she's a woman of color. And I think a lot of people were excited by that. And I think it probably like got her in, some people held out against her, but other voters liked it and it helped her. I think it was probably ended up being a wash really in the end. But it's like, again, it's kind of like, they resurrected at the beginning of Kamala's campaign the old Hillary Clinton hashtag, I'm with her. I remember yelling at the TV, like, it's not about like, we're with her. She's supposed to be watching our back. She's supposed to be for us. That's why the ad that everybody talks about, even though I don't think many people actually saw it, that Trump put out was the, anti-trans ad, right? She's for they, them. Donald Trump is for you. Was like, but it was very powerful as a message, and it kind of, I don't really, I think it's one of those things that like probably fewer people saw it than you think, but still, that was the tenor of the campaign, right? Not that so much that she was talking about trans stuff, but that, it was about her and the Democrats and, but it wasn't about like the voters were, and it was like, well, we'll just, you'll get over it. The prices are not going to keep rising quite as fast at such a high rate forever. You'll be fine. And it's like voters are like, I'm not feeling fine, and I don't feel good. And it's like, so I mean, really seriously, and Donald Trump really didn't address a lot of these issues either. But Donald Trump didn't win. Kamala Harris lost. It was hers to lose. She was the incumbent. Donald Trump's been convicted of 34 felonies. He owes $500 million to Jean Carroll. I mean, Donald Trump was a grievously wounded candidate who should have gotten 33% of the vote. Under any normal circumstance. I mean, I think, I think Michael Dukakis would have wiped the floor with him. It's like, so she really she completely, it was suicide. And I don't even know. I think it'll be interesting if we ever get a behind the scenes look at that campaign to see to what extent she was just told to do this. And inside she was chafing and she knew it was wrong. But they told her to do it anyway. The DNC.
Wait, what do you mean? Told her to do what?
To,
do you mean?
Told her to like not run, to like not campaign for 40 days, for example. That kind of thing.
Oh man, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean,
or was it her?
See, with Kamala Harris, we have to close it. But last time when the Kamala Harris ran, she also ran a horrible campaign, if you remember, because she ran out of money. I distinctly remember this. She ran out of money before she got to the thing, and she was like, I'm out of cash, I'm broke. And they were effectively saying she was in all this extravagant spending, the flying in the aircraft, like she was living the life in the way of her own self-conception of how awesome she was.
Yeah, and when they do that, by the way, I always think, man, like not only are you squandering money when you fly private, like Jimmy Carter used to go back and talk to everybody and coach Like, those are votes, man. You're missing an opportunity to connect with voters. Each one of those voters is going to go back to their hometown and say, Jimmy fucking Carter came back and shook my hand.
Yeah,
I mean,
they're going to remember that forever. Yeah. Ted, man, thank you for this, Ted. Always appreciate you, man. Ted
Thank
Raw, political cartoonist, syndicated columnist. You can catch Ted on TMI, Too Much Information, on YouTube, Monday through Friday from 10 to 12. He is coming up after this show. Thank you, my man. You have a good one, Ted.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your show.
You too. Thanks, man. All right. I would like to bring in the man of the hour, Esteban Carrillo. He is a Beirut-based Ecuadorian journalist and current editor for The Cradle. Previously with Tell Us Her English, The Cradle is a great outlet, man. How you doing, man? You doing okay?
Hi, Jamarl. I'm doing good. How are you?
I am doing well. I wanted to go into what is taking place in Lebanon.
Mhm.
There seems to be border skirmishes between the jihadists that are in Syria, that have taken over Syria, and the Lebanese military. Am I understanding it right?
There was, yes, you're right. There were a few days ago. There were a number of injuries among the Lebanese army in the east of the country after these, as you well named them, jihadis, these extremists that are currently in control of Syria. They opened fire on the Lebanese army multiple times, right? This wasn't by mistake, so to speak. This was a concerted effort. We discussed last week, I think it was last week, Jamarl, that these groups, they didn't go to Syria to be peaceful neighbors, to build a democracy, to give rights to everyone. These people, this was not their goal in Syria. Now that they're in power, we're starting to see kind of the reality crop up, despite the best efforts of these former ISIS and Al Qaeda warlords who just got a extreme makeover, so to speak. You cannot, right? A tiger cannot change its stripes. So this is what happened.
They give a jihadist a glamour shot.
Exactly. Yeah, like they trim their beards, they buy them some nice Armani suits, they teach them how to walk, how to speak. But at the end of the day, the Syria's new justice minister, right? The country's new justice minister, over the weekend, videos emerged of him.
I can't even show the video of the
overseeing the public execution of women.
It's
this is, as I said, this is those type of people. So the Lebanese army at this point, it's finds itself in a very difficult position, right? Because on the one hand, in the south of Lebanon, you have the Israeli army still committing violations, still destroying villages, entering villages that they couldn't enter during the actual ground invasion because of the presence of Hezbollah. Now that Hezbollah has withdrawn and is actually standing by the ceasefire, the Israeli army feels emboldened to violate the terms over 1,000 times at this point, over 1,000 violations since the start. And the Lebanese army has to stand in between, right? They are supposed to be the ones deployed to the south. As the Israeli army withdraws from any given village, any given town, the Lebanese army must enter and take control. They are also often coming under attack by the Israelis. And now they also have to deal with this situation in the east of the country, along the border with Syria. Lebanon is completely surrounded at this point. Lebanon, it's a seaside nation that all of its borders are either with Israel or with Syria, right? Lebanon has two countries bordering it, and it's
But wait a minute. So the Lebanese, okay. The thing that always throws me is because there's the Lebanese military and Hezbollah, and these two things are different. The Lebanese military itself is dealing with border skirmishes with the jihadists. The Hezbollah itself has pulled back from various regions based under the terms of the peace deal. So Hezbollah and the Lebanese military are engaged, but they're engaged with different actors. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I mean, the Lebanese army is, well, the armed forces of the nation, right?
But they're not fighting Israel at all. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm splitting.
I mean, the thing is, Jamarl, that Lebanon is officially, constitutionally at war with Israel, right? There's never been any peace treaty. There's never been any normalization. Israel is the enemy, the de facto enemy of the Lebanese state, and has been for decades. And this extends to the Lebanese army, although the Lebanese army itself, at the very least, in the recent decades, hasn't really been much of a force. It's never really been a force, the Lebanese army. Hence, the need for a militia, the need for a popular liberation movement, which, regardless of what you think about Hezbollah, this is the purpose that they serve. This is the purpose that they serve originally. This is the reason of their existence, right? This is the same situation with Hamas. If there were no Israel, if there were no military occupation, if there were no crimes against humanity being committed on a systematic and historical basis, you wouldn't need a resistance. You wouldn't need a group to take up arms, right? It's simply it's not compatible. But in any case, that's not the reality that they find themselves in. So now the Lebanese army, it's like I said, it's caught between a rock and a hard place. Truly, it's underfunded, underprepared. It's just very difficult to see the Lebanese army defending Lebanese sovereignty, and that's sadly the state of things in the country, and has been for a very, very long time. And not, Lebanon is a highly corrupt country. It's a highly, highly corrupt country, but the lack of strength that the Lebanese army has, it's by design, right? It's by design. It's all the Western powers and Gulf powers colluding and working together to keep the army, well enough to be fed and paid, I guess, on time, but not enough to actually defend their country, right? Lebanon doesn't have air defense systems. We know that already. Right? We saw the Blitzkrieg campaign that Israel conducted. Lebanon has no air defense systems. If the Lebanese army were to pick up arms, their actual weapons, and start fighting Israel, the United States would flip its lid. The U.S. embassy would all of a sudden just cut all of the aid that the Lebanese army depends on. The Saudis would do the same. Saudi Arabia already, remember just a few years ago, they sanctioned Lebanon because a minister criticized the war in Yemen. Before, way before the genocide in Gaza started, back when Yemen was, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, a Lebanese minister criticized it. Next day, the Saudis sanctioned them. So imagine if the Lebanese army picks up arms against the Israelis. It's not going to go well for them in any.
They're prevented from fighting. Let's talk. Okay, so let's talk about Syria for a bit, because I do want to hit Yemen for. Okay,
sure.
Let me partition these. Let's go to Syria first. Turkey has made the point of saying that if it starts to break apart, that they would get involved, meaning, they would get more aggressive in getting involved if they believe it's going to unravel. And this is fascinating to me. I had a gentleman on from Turkey the other day, and he was making this point of saying, Turkish position in this is not all that secure. The reality of it is they have a country that they've overthrown with jihadists of all different types, that now they're going to try to take the weapons away from, which may not want to give those weapons up. Not to mention, you may have all of these different groups that end up going into this kind of civil war that happens again as a response to the jihadists taking over Syria in the first place. Meaning, the Assad government might have fallen, but you have all of these other groups that are there that may not be okay and acquiesce to this kind of religious rule or this kind of caliphate that these guys want to enact in Syria itself. And so they're basically saying this is going to happen on the Turkish border if it does happen, which means that there are going to be a huge number of refugees streaming into Turkey, which is something Turkey doesn't necessarily want. So now Turkey is saying, look, if this starts to fall apart, we're going to get further involved in the country. Do you think he's saying that because he knows that there's a huge potential of it actually falling apart, that HTS doesn't have the capability of keeping Syria together in the way that they are projecting that they're going to be able to?
I feel like in Ankara, just like in Tel Aviv, there's actually the expectation that HTS is not going to be able to hold things together, because more chaos in Syria means more gains for both nations, for Turkey and for Israel. At this point, Israel controls about between 30 to 40% of Syria's water supplies. Their largest dams in the south are currently under Israeli support. Because again, these extremists in control of the country, they don't concern themselves with what's happening in the south. They have nothing to say about Israel encroaching in their land, attacking their cities, taking control of their water resources. They, they are too happy welcoming, all of these Western and Gulf officials that keep going to Syria, right? Just today, there was a delegation from Bahrain. Yesterday, there was a delegation from somewhere else. In the north, Ankara is backing an offensive against the Kurds. Just today, again, drone strikes hitting the city of Kobani, also known as Ain al-Arab, in the north of near the border. And yesterday, Turkish officials said something very interesting. They said, "Let us take control of the prisons that are holding thousands of ISIS fighters in the north, the prisons that are controlled by the Kurds, who are supported, of course, by the United States. Let us give the keys to the prison to us. We'll take control of them." Right, which should raise many eyebrows. I think the situation in the north of Syria is really getting lost in the shuffle. You saw what happened, with the attacks, for example, in the U.S., the New Year attacks, right? You saw like these terror attacks, and now you're seeing the incoming national security advisor, and really just like this whole like concerted, the military/media apparatus, talking a lot about ISIS again, right? They're talking about the terrorists and ISIS and etc. ISIS is at this point in control of Syria, right? And they are in government in Syria. They're being legitimized. There's thousands of fighters again in these prisons that Turkey is now saying give us control of. So I feel that what's happening in Syria at the end of the day, it's going to become an agent of chaos, and not just of chaos for the Middle East, but global chaos, right? Transnational terrorism. We are entering the war on terror 2.0, right? When this is not longer just going to be confined to any one country, to any one region. This is being spread out. This terrorism is being globalized. And I think my point by bringing up the attacks in the U.S. and the response from officials, it's that it's an attempt to stick it in people's minds, to make sure that they know that, for example, now they're saying that it's Mexico, that the ISIS is coming from Mexico, right? That now that's the excuse. So all of a sudden, if you have a revived ISIS, remember, ISIS was defeated between 2017 and 2019. They were eradicated. They were gone. They were done, except for the groups that remained in the areas under the control of the U.S. government. And again, which are also the control of the U.S. government.
And by the way, we protected Idlib. I mean, like, I remember because they had gotten to the point where Assad, Russia, and Iran had taken back the overwhelming majority of the territory. And the question became up of, okay, well, what about Idlib? And the UN said there are like 40,000 terrorists that are in Idlib. And I remember the US said something to the effect of basically acting as the Air Force for this group of jihadists. It was astonishing. And now you can kind of see why, because they came screaming out of Idlib after setting up their own fiefdom there in order to take over Syria proper. I guess my thing is, okay, so do you think the original objective was, well, yeah, let Jelani take it because ultimately he's not going to be able to hold it, which would allow us to get militarily involved once it falls apart? Meaning there was no expectation that Syria would be able to be held by HTS, that all things being equal, they were never going to allow a terrorist to occupy the government of that state. They assumed that it would fall apart, which would allow them a pretext to get further involved, either from the standpoint of Israel or, for that matter, Turkey. I don't know what Turkey would get out of that falling apart, though, to be honest. I mean, they could take more land, I suppose.
Yeah.
But do they need to if HTS is working on behalf of Istanbul anyway?
Well, first of all, HTS, back when they were called the Nusra Front, or I think even before, when they were still, Al-Qaeda, when they were still honest about their affiliations, they took control of Idlib thanks to U.S. support, thanks to U.S. weapons, right? CIA provided anti-tank weapons, etc. This is how HTS, the now current name of this organization, takes control of Idlib, and then holds it thanks to Turkish support. Idlib has a 97% poverty rate. Idlib, under Sharia law since at least 2017. Holding it with an iron grip, but for example, Idlib had electricity, as opposed to the rest of the country, right? The rest of Syria under crushing sanctions. Idlib had electricity thanks to Turkey. Idlib had humanitarian aid shipments from the UN entering via Turkey. Now, these humanitarian aid shipments were being resold by Julani and crew to buy property in Turkey. Again, a tiger does not change its stripes.
Right.
So I think what Turkey wants at the end of the day is territory, right? We talk a lot about Israel being the expansionist state and the idea of greater Israel and everything, but we forget that Turkey, and in particular President Erdogan, they have the same desire. They have the same design. This is a man who has a real longing for the Ottoman Empire. He wants to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. He talks about Aleppo being part of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, and probably as far as Damascus. So what's happening in Syria at the end of the day, it's going to be the Balkanization of the country, right? This is, I guess, what the United States really wants. They want the south to be controlled by Israel, which also gives them a new front against Lebanon. They want the north to be controlled by HTS / Turkey, right, as far as possible. And then the east is where the resources, Syria's resources are, right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. doesn't want to live there, right? I mean, Turkey is talking about that as well. No, I'm sorry, it's not Turkey. It's Shara. It's the head of HTS.
Right.
He's negotiating with the Kurds, the U.S.-backed Kurds in the east of Syria, to allow them to be part of the government in exchange, for about 80% of oil revenues. From these oil fields. So we'll have to see, right? I think I've said it before here in your show that
Wait. Say that one more time. You said they're negotiating. Mm-hmm. Say that one more time. You said Jelani is negotiating with the Kurds, because I know that they were basically saying, if you don't put your weapons down, you're going to die.
The Kurds
we're going to bury you.
Yeah,
but you said they were trying to make a deal.
There needs to be unity, and they were willing to become part of a new Syrian army if there are, agreements and guarantees and etc. But what Julani is asking is that because the Kurds are in control of Syria's largest oil fields, right? Syria's largest oil fields host U.S. military bases, U.S. occupation troops deployed in all of these fields. But what Shara wants is the profits. He wants the profits from these fields, to reconstruct Syria. Now we know that sanctions are being eased, restrictions are being eased. There's calls, like let's leave the sanctions now that ISIS is in control of Syria. But what Shara wants is the oil, right? And there are discussions ongoing between the Kurdish leaders and HTS, but there's no agreements reached yet. And I think one of the reasons that there's no agreements is because there's a war raging right now in the north of Syria between the allies of HTS, supported by Turkey, and the Kurds, right? These militant groups, these Turkish-backed militants, are trying to take control of the east of Aleppo, approaching these ISIS prisons, and also because they're in the same region, the oil fields and etc. So we'll have to see. Because Turkey has pledged to eradicate the Kurdish threat in the south of Turkey, right, in the north of Syria. And we know that they mean these groups. They in particularly mean the Syrian Democratic Forces. They don't say it by name, but that's who they mean. That's who they.
The U.S. is also there, though. I mean, I guess
it's also there, but the U.S. has abandoned the Kurds before. This is not, the first time it would happen. The U.S. has walked away from them many years ago. I feel like at this point, especially with a Donald Trump coming to the White House, and all of a sudden, Donald Trump is he's done a 180, right, from his first term. His first term was America first. Let's bring the troops home. Now his logline is America first, let's take as much land as we can. Right? He's talking about Canada. He's talking about Mexico. He's talking about Greenland. He is talking about all hell breaking loose in the Middle East. He's not going to de-escalate, right? He's really not going to de-escalate. And I think I've said it before, right? The only difference really between Donald Trump and a Democratic candidate, it's the forms, it's the manners, it's the way he says it, right? It's really just about that.
Oh man, there is a difference. I'm telling you, Trump has a willingness or openness to make a deal. Meaning, if you can make a deal and appease his ego, you will make that deal. You can't do that with Democrats.
Maybe,
they just fundamentally believe in war. Like they literally believe in a forever war. Like, for example, when Donald Trump said something about bringing the troops out of Syria, for example. Okay, well, it was the Democratic Party and, these people affiliated with the military that was against it. When he wanted to make a deal with North Korea, it was the Democratic Party and the military, or at the very least, the media space that was against it. Meaning his own instincts would bring him a willingness or an openness to make a deal in a way that is just not on the table with Democrats. And that's not saying much because they're still pro-war, right? But they're still an aggressive foreign posture. But with Democrats, there is no capacity for it. There is no thought about it. There is no ability to negotiate. And then you get this kind of air of self-righteousness on top of being, pro-militarist. Whereas, Trump is more shameless about it. Yeah, we want to take Greenland. Do you have a right to it? Nope, but they should give it to us anyway. Like, that's honest.
I think, I think you're right. I think you're correct. This is a man that at the end of the day, what he likes is making a deal, right?
Yeah,
this is what drives him, man. And I think that makes him a disruptor, right? In the extent that a person that holds, the highest office in the land, in the U.S. empire, can be a disruptor, but like to bring it back to Syria in particular. Syria, I think right now what it's at play here is the gas pipelines. Is the gas pipelines to Europe. This is what the Gulf wants. This is what Qatar wants. Yeah. This is what Turkey wants as well. So I feel like we're not gonna see an actual government form in Syria, right? I think that the seeds have already been planted by HTS when they said it's going to take 4 years before elections, right? So until then, what, right? And actually, what's more disturbing about this whole situation is that you, for example, have outlets like NPR, right, the National Public Radio, referring to Ahmed al-Shara as the president of Syria. And you forgive me, but when were the last elections in Syria, right? They went from one dictator to the next, and NPR is going out here and saying he's the president. So again, the normalization, not just of ISIS, not just the whitewashing of terrorist warlords, but also the complete disregard for the international law, for conventions
at all, for that matter. I mean, he's just effectively stolen a country, and they're calling it. One last thing, Yemen. Before I let you go, I'm fascinated by Yemen. I really am. They have had like a one-man band of defense, or at the very least trying to defend Palestine in the way that they could defend Palestine, and pushing back on Israelis' occupation and just murderous kill spree. And they have done this either through shipping, like basically firing at anything that's going across the Red Sea that's associated with Israel, but also firing missiles that seem to have gotten far more accurate over the course of time that the war has taken place. They said at one point, there are no red lines. Like, this is not a situation where we have red lines. And they apparently pointed out we're not Syria either. Give me your take on Yemen. I mean, their ability to resist in this way is rather astonishing to me. How are they getting this capability to fire off missiles like that? Where are they getting the weapons from? Is this coming from Iran? Is this coming from China, Russia? Where are they getting this kind of technical acumen from in order to launch these missiles?
Well, Yemen is, first of all, as an actor within the resistance axis, Yemen is different than the rest. Yemen is not like Hezbollah. Yemen is not like Hamas or even Syria, in that Yemen had been fighting a war for the past 10 years, an active war, right? Lebanon wasn't, Syria wasn't, not in the way that it was with Yemen, right? Again, I mentioned it. Yemen before Gaza was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. You were talking about famine, you were talking about cholera, you were talking about almost 500,000 dead. So the Ansar Allah, right, the resistance group that controls the capitals and the main port, and honestly, where 80% of Yemenis live, they have been waging a war for a decade.
Wow.
So when you're seeing their attacks today, they don't their preparations were made under fire. You know what I mean?
Oh, I
Their
see.
development of their own weaponry came out of necessity. Of course, it has Iranian help, right? As far as we know, it's mainly Iranian blueprints, right? The Iranian
Okay.
gives them the expertise, and then the Yemenis implement it themselves. Because I think it's a bit dishonest, as it tends to be Western media, to talk about Iranian shipments to Yemen when Yemen has been blockaded for the past 10 years, air, sea, and land blockade imposed by Saudi Arabia, supported by NATO. Yemen, its largest land border, it's with Saudi Arabia, right? Then it shares another land border with Oman, which is essentially a neutral nation in this entire crisis that is developing in the region. And then, as far as the sea goes, if Dan Sarallah controls Hodeida port, right, which is the main port in Yemen. If a ship wants to dock at Hodeida port, it needs to get a clearance from the UN. And even after they get clearance from the UN, for the past decade, these ships were often taken by the Saudi Navy to Jeddah, to a port in Jeddah, where they underwent another inspection before being allowed into Yemen, or simply just being seized and never arriving. So I don't think Yemen is a case of getting weapon shipments, right? Not like Hezbollah, that you had Syria.
Yeah.
You had Iraq, Syria, you had a land corridor that went into Lebanon that is being cut off now. Not like Hamas, that also had a way to get weapons through Egypt or through the West Bank via Jordan, etc. Yemen has been they've been developing their own weapons, right? Yemen is not getting missile shipments. These ballistic missiles that are being sent, they are indigenous. They are making them there. And also, maybe because of the way that the Houthis are portrayed, right? Like these sandal-wearing sheep herders who, wouldn't know, I don't know, just the most dehumanizing way that Western media always portrays them, right?
They're more sophisticated than that.
Not as an actual government, not as an actual force, not as actual officials, etc., as a military. They have, as you said, Jamarl, they have been getting more accurate with every attack. Right now, you see ballistic hypersonic missiles that are landing in Tel Aviv, that are hitting power stations, that are hitting military bases. These are being launched despite the fact that the US and the UK have launched hundreds, maybe even thousands of airstrikes inside Yemen since last January. For a full year, they have been bombing Sana'a and Hodeida. The Israelis also, over recent months have been starting to bomb very heavily these cities. And yet their abilities are not diminished, right? So I think there's a lot more to Yemen that we understand, a lot more to Yemen, right? Maybe it's very likely that over the past decade of war, what they have built is, like in Gaza, underground infrastructure, like in the south of Lebanon as well, underground infrastructure from where they can attack. And I think it is a disadvantage for the US, UK, and Israel that they can only conduct airstrikes. They cannot really go in, right? I mean, because the UK-US campaign is already illegal in both nations, in both Washington and London. This campaign is being conducted without parliamentary or congressional approval. This is the definition of an illegal war, what's happening in Yemen. So they can't all of a sudden, on top of everything, start sending troops right into the land. Like at this point, we are really reaching a point in which law just is not going to matter anymore anywhere in the world, and it's really just going to be a free-for-all. But in any case, this is why Yemen has been able to maintain its to increase its capabilities as time goes on. We haven't seen a diminishing of Yemen's capabilities, and also there's a drive, right? Yemen, I feel like, has proven that more than anyone else in the Arab world is committed to the to stopping the genocide in Gaza, right? You see these marches every Friday in Sana'a. You're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. And not just in Sana'a, in other cities as well, that come out marching, with the Palestinian, with the Yemeni, with the Lebanese flag, and they are chanting for escalation. These people aren't marching and saying, let's reach an agreement. Let's have peace. They're saying, let's take the fight to the Zionist enemy. If we need to march, we'll march. If we need to fire more missiles, fire more missiles. If they're going to bomb us, they've been bombing us since 2015, 2014. They've been destroying our country. Yemen it might be, some people might take it as a bit disingenuous, what I'm going to say, but Yemen doesn't have much to lose, if anything, at this point, right? Besides human lives, Yemen is the Arab world's poorest country. It's already, Ansar Allah is already treated as a terrorist organization at best, if not, like I said, as a bunch of...
Yeah, it's like, what do you have to lose in that situation? No, I understand. I get your point.
They stand on their own.
Esteban, man, thank you for this. I always appreciate your analysis on this stuff. You are damn good at giving this kind of understanding to the audience of what's taking place in this region of the world. Esteban Carrillo, he's a Beirut-based Ecuadorian journalist and current editor for The Cradle, previously with Tella, Sir English, and a damn good friend of the show. Happy New Year, man. Thank you for this.
Happy New Year as well, Jamal. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. I want to go to our next guest, a man who I always enjoy talking to, the one and only John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou is former CIA, what should I call you, John? I can't.
Officer.
Okay, former CIA officer and author. He wrote books, The Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You can follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. John, you're one of my most interesting people to talk to put it mildly.
Well, thank
and
you,
I always
Jamarl.
appreciate these conversations. So
Thank you, sir.
For one, Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year. And I have to say, if I could interrupt you for a second, I love listening to Esteban Carrillo. He has such a deep understanding of the Middle East. I spent much of my adult life in the Middle East, and I still learn something every time I listen to Esteban speak. He's really great.
Really good. Oh, he's really good. He's been a really good friend of the show. And he stayed with me after everything happened with the radio station. So no, I definitely appreciate him. One of the interesting things that came out was that reporting is out that Hezbollah is basically not Hezbollah, I'm sorry, Iran is being made to leave Syria, that they've removed their military assets from Syria at this point with the new government, if you want to call it a government, that's in play, basically telling them to leave. This government is much closer to Israel, has not taken any issue with Israel taking massive swaths of Syria at this point. I think Esteban pointed out 30% of the water is gone to Israel. They're like 20 miles away from Damascus. And anytime it is brought up to Al-Jilani or any part of that government, they have nothing really to say about it. What is this going to mean for Iran? I mean, their situation in the Middle East has gotten more fraught, right? With the destruction of Syria, with the collapse of Syria.
It has. Yeah, it has. This is one of those classic, almost Cold War style power plays that I think people are going to study in the future. You've got a new leader of Syria, or of some truncated version of Syria, who on paper ought to be an Osama bin Laden style enemy of the West, and he's not. He's not. And not only is he not, despite having been the deputy chief of ISIS and the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, he is now being courted by the United States to the point where an old friend of mine, Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and two other senior State Department officials flew to Damascus 2 weeks ago to meet with him. And while they were there, the State Department officially lifted its $10 million bounty that it had on his head. So that's number one. Number two, you just accurately pointed out that the Israelis have essentially invaded, for lack of a better word, Syria. And they've taken a swath of land along the border with no objection at all from this new Syrian leadership. In the meantime, Jolani has the support of the Turkish government, and now de facto the American government. The Russians have evacuated. The Iranians have evacuated. Hezbollah has been essentially decapitated, at least militarily. And so it looks like this is exactly what the United States wanted to happen. Not just the United States, but Turkey and Israel as well. This is something that I think literally nobody saw coming.
No, not anybody I talked to. I mean, everybody was like shell shocked, just at the speed and rapidity of the collapse.
That's it right there.
But is this, I can't tell though, is this a situation where the US did this with the expectation that it was going to collapse? Meaning,
No, I think
they did this
frankly,
with the expectation that he's going to be in power.
I don't think the United States did this. I think that the U.S. was as taken by surprise as anybody else was. I think the Turks did this. And when I say that I don't think the U.S. saw it coming, that's yet another policy failure of the United States. I think they came out of it smelling like a rose. But this was something that the Turks had been working on for quite some time. And, you know, there was some telegraphing of it a few weeks in advance. The Turks have had absolutely terrible relations with the Israelis for the last 15 years. Right. Absolutely terrible relations. And just a couple of weeks before this happened, the Turks made this grand announcement that they've decided to turn around on Israel, and they're going to begin the renormalization of relations with Israel, and everybody's going to live happily ever after. And those of us who watch the Middle East said, what's that supposed to mean? Where did that come from? And the next thing you know, Assad falls apart. His whole family flees to Russia. The Iranians pull out, the Russians pull out, and the Turks essentially call the shots in Syria.
Wow. How much control do you think the U.S. has in Syria now? Now that all of this has taken place, now that you have the situation where Turkey seems to have the whip hand in this. And just to be clear, the reason why I said the U.S. is because, you know, going all the way back to the Bush administration, the U.S. have been training these guys with the idea of trying to take out Assad. And so, like, you don't believe that the U.S. was involved in the training, the funding?
Oh, sure. No, of course they were. Yeah, of course they were. And, you know, let me back up. I worked on Syria for much of my career, and having been inside the CIA at the time, it was fascinating to watch the transition in the level of diplomatic relations that we had with Syria. We had no diplomatic relations at the toward the end of the Hafez al-Assad administration, and so when the Gulf War broke out with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, the U.S. approached Hafez al-Assad and said, we're putting together this coalition. The Egyptians are with us, you know, the Tunisians, the Algerians, the Moroccans, all the Gulf countries. We want you to be with us too. Hafez al-Assad saw an opportunity to normalize relations with the United States, and he jumped in. He committed something like 1,200 troops. It was nothing, but it was symbolically important. Right. The U.S. we opened an embassy in Damascus. The Syrians opened an embassy in Washington. And we said, hey, for the first time in decades, we're going to have normalized relations with Syria. This is great. Those normalized relations continued until George W. Bush was president. And we decided to attack Iraq again in 2002. And we went to the Syrians and said, we're going to attack Iraq, and we want you to be a part of this coalition again. And the Syrians said, we don't have any beef with Iraq right now. And we share a very large border with them. We can't handle Iraqi refugees. We're not interested in helping you. And we said, well, if you won't help us by committing troops, then you need to allow us overflight clearance so we can cross Syria on our way to bomb Baghdad. And they said, we're not in a state of war with the Iraqis, and we will not offer you overflight clearance. And we broke diplomatic relations with Syria. Diplomatic relations because of that. Diplomatic relations that were decades in the making. We just broke them. We closed our embassy in Damascus. We threw the Syrians out of Washington, and we decided to support whatever opposition was available to us in Syria. That opposition happened to be formerly known as Al-Qaeda. And that's how we got into this position where we had decided that literally anybody was better than Bashar al-Assad. Now, of course, you and I know that that's ridiculous.
Right.
But that became the policy. Literally anybody is better than Bashar al-Assad. Now, there were so many different factions in Syria that we were confident for many years that nobody would take over. Even if we couldn't take over, the Kurds weren't strong enough. Al-Qaeda wasn't strong enough. Hezbollah wasn't strong enough. And it was just going to be a state of chaos. And chaos was good for us because it diverted the Syrians from focusing on Israel. And we always do Israel's bidding in the region anyway, until the Turks decided that they didn't like the status quo. And the Turks, armed and financed and offered logistical support to their faction. And the next thing you know, the whole place fell apart.
So I guess, and that's kind of goes to my point. So is chaos the ultimate point? I mean,
it very well could be at this point. I think right now, today, yes, chaos is the point, because the Israelis are diverted in Gaza and in southern Lebanon. And so if the Israelis don't have to worry about a regime in Damascus that's friendly to Hezbollah and Iran, then that's better for the Israelis. So right now, yes, chaos is likely a part of U.S. policy.
Wow. How far do you think, meaning, is this a situation where Israel is going to continue to take more and more land and Turkey is going to take more and more land? I mean, the relationship seems to be at this point that there's been some kind of communication between Turkey and Israel, almost like a deconfliction between
absolutely,
the two.
Yes.
Wow,
yeah, absolutely. Yes. I think, well, the Turkish policy has been very clear for many years. They want a 20-mile buffer zone along the border, along the entire border. Okay. And they want to just take Syrian territory. Now, of course, international law dictates that they're not entitled to take 1 inch of Syrian territory, let alone 20 miles of it. But that has long been Turkish policy. Israeli policy is not necessarily to take Syrian land, although God knows they have with the Golan Heights.
Right.
I think it's become a de facto policy for Israel to take more Syrian land. I don't think that they want any more than they have, because they're going to have to commit more troops then to maintain it. I think they like things just the way they are, so that they don't have to worry about Syria while they continue to bombard Lebanon.
It's a government that's not hostile to their interests, so they can just focus on Gaza and the West Bank.
And look at it this way too, Jamarl. You've got Barbara Leaf and company in Damascus. What were they promising there? Were they promising development assistance? Were they promising maybe the construction of a hospital or an airstrip or an electrical grid? What were they promising in exchange for a promise of no hostility, or maybe eventually a path to the restoration of diplomatic relations? They didn't go over there just to shake hands and kiss cheeks. There were some kind of substantive discussions that had taken place, and we just don't know what the details are.
Do you think they're going to be able to form a government, or do you think it's going to collapse?
I think they'll form a government.
Okay.
And I think they'll form a government because both the Turks and the Americans are going to stop, at least in the near term, any challenges to what this new government may turn into.
Basically put in money, investment, building, et cetera. I mean, basically to try to ameliorate many of the issues that Assad was dealing with. They try to get rid of those issues, because Turkey has been pretty clear. If it falls apart, they're going to get more involved. I want to talk about Iran for a bit. You wrote the book on Iran, so you would be the person who may know. Trump is saying that he's going to come in with a pressure campaign against Iran at this point. How do you think they are going to respond to that? I mean, when I had a conversation with Morandi, and he pointed out, he said, we are reevaluating our defensive capabilities against it, meaning we could accept a fight with Israel because Israel can't necessarily beat us 1-on-1. By the same token, bombings from the United States is a different issue, and we are assessing what we're going to do. Was it a mistake for Iran to not get further involved when the Hezbollah, or for that matter, the Hamas, or for that matter, even Yemen, was fighting Israel, as opposed to waiting for each one to be individually defeated? I know Yemen is still fighting, but Yemen is farther away. Did they make a mistake?
I think that was a serious mistake. And I think that the Iranian people will tell you that was a serious mistake. The new Iranian government, and it's new just in the last several months, is already wildly unpopular on this issue, because the Iranian people view it as having walked away from Syria and from Hezbollah, as you said, lacking in their support for Hamas, and sort of turning their backs on the Houthis. Aside from supplying missiles and drones, what have the Iranians really done in Yemen? Not much. They just supply.
is the one
Say
who
again?
makes what the Ayatollah is the one that makes the decision on military capacity. Like, wouldn't
Yeah.
that be on him, not necessarily Jesus, always have a hard time saying the man's name. Przeskian.
Yeah, Pezeshkian.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the American view for the most part. I have Iranian friends like Marandi who have corrected me when I've said, well, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and they said, no. Ayatollah Khamenei has left this to the civilian government. He is the religious leader. And I responded just a week ago to a friend of mine, but that's not been the situation since the 1980s.
Right.
And I'm told that's the situation now. That, Hillary Clinton once said that Iran is not a theocracy, it's a military dictatorship. And the dictatorship is run through a civilian who is the president of the republic. And that's not what American analysis has been since the 1980s. So Pezeshkian is the one who's taking the heat on these issues. People are complaining now that, he was elected as a reformer. He's not a reformer. He's a technocrat who's weak and who doesn't understand international affairs and doesn't understand Iran's long history in Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and elsewhere in the region. And he's blowing it. And if you look at it on the surface of things, he's blown it. I mean, this situation in Syria was a major defeat for the Iranian government. The Iranians, along with the Russians, of course, were the power players in Syria.
Right.
And not only are they no longer the power players, they're not even in Syria anymore. That's what a serious, significant defeat this was for Russia and Iran. Hezbollah, same situation. I was going to say Hezbollah was decapitated, literally decapitated with the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. A week later, the assassination of his deputy. And 2 weeks after that, the assassination of his deputy. And so there is no Hezbollah in Syria anymore.
I kept thinking about, what is his name? He said, they were saying that they were going to, General Wesley Clark, saying that they were going to go through all of these countries within the course of all of these years. Now, they might have gotten the years wrong, but if you look at the countries that have been taken down, they have gone in a certain order of Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Iran was kind of the last one on that list. Do you think that plan is still in action? Meaning, because if I look at this over the course of, let's say, 20, 30 years, it does seem to be correct that Wesley Clark ultimately ended up being right, even through multiple presidents. It still seemed to be the same plan and playbook, whether it's momentum, I don't know what it is, but it seems that they are effectively doing what Wesley Clark said about going through all of these Middle Eastern countries, with Iran being the last one. Is there some playbook that is in effect that has not necessarily been stated, but that each president is effectively running with?
Yes. What the statement that Wesley Clark made, he made something like 25 years ago.
Right.
It's kind of funny to me, though, that people still quote it, because for those of us who've been inside government at those, in those organizations, State Department, National Security Council, CIA, he just stated an obvious off-the-shelf policy. It's always been our policy to overthrow or interfere with these governments that we consider to be enemies. Governments like Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, whoever happens to be in charge in Iran, the Assad family. It's U.S. policy to seek the overthrow and replacements of those governments. That's not new. It's not even particularly controversial in government circles. And it's not something that we're planning to do next month or 6 months from now or whatever. It's the ultimate long-term policy. So to answer your question, the answer is yes.
Yes.
That is what we're trying to do. It's meant to be a culmination of years of activity.
I see.
And it's not even to say, Jamarl, that the policy is what resulted in the demise of the Assad government. Perhaps things that the U.S. did helped to result in it, but the result wasn't a direct one. But yeah, that's just an off-the-shelf policy that state and DoD have that we've worked toward for decades.
Last question before I let you go. Zelensky, in a recent interview with Les Friedman, there's an interesting part in that interview where he points out where they're talking about corruption. And Zelensky turns around and says, well, we were supposed to get $170 billion, but we only saw half of that money. Where's the rest of the money go? How does money get maneuvered and lost in situations like this when there's so much money, where you're talking about like hundreds of billions of dollars? Even if somebody takes $1 billion, somebody may not necessarily see where that $1 billion goes. How does that money get used and spent in a way where people can, I guess, extract money from it? Because when he said that, I was thinking to myself, well, Zelensky's probably right. There's probably money somewhere that is just being ferreted away through some sort of organization. And maybe I may be asking this question in somewhat of an odd way, but I hope you understand.
No. It's a good question, and the answer is going to make you shake your head. The U.S. has a policy that dates to the Clinton to the Hillary Clinton tenure at the State Department, that aid must go through Ukrainian banks. Okay. Not through American banks. It goes through Ukrainian banks. And at every step of the way in that transfer process, money is taken out. And I'll give you an example, a specific example that's kind of personal to me. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton promised $15 million to the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, Patriarch Bartholomew I, the leader of Orthodox Christians worldwide. $15 million in exchange for the establishment of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as an autocephalous church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church used to be under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay? Hillary Clinton wanted them to break off, declare independence, and for the patriarch to recognize that independence. The patriarch said, I can't do that. The Ukrainian church has been a part of the Russian church for 1,000 years, literally 1,000 years, since 1000 AD. She said, how's 15 million? They said, okay, we'll do it. So the State Department said, I know this is, as an Orthodox Christian, this makes me sick to my stomach.
I can never do this. Nothing can make me do this. Here's $15 million. Yeah. Okay.
So the State Department transferred the 15 million to a Ukrainian bank. The Ukrainian bank then transferred 10 million to the Patriarchate. And the Patriarch came back to Hillary and said, hey, we only got 10 million of the 15. And she said, well, that's a problem you're going to have to deal with. Now imagine that happening on a greater scale. Yeah, this is what happens in Ukraine. The money just vanishes into thin air. And then all of a sudden you have these Ukrainian oligarchs that nobody has ever heard of transferring billions of dollars to banks all across the Western world. It's just out and out thievery is what it is.
Wow, John. Wow. That is aggravating, John.
Isn't that awful?
Because that's our money that is just being ferreted away into somebody's pocket, and we have no idea where, and the war just keeps on going. Mm-hmm. John Kiriakou, man, thank you for this. I always appreciate you, John. And
my pleasure.
Best stories in the world. I'm always fascinated by that stuff. John Kiriakou, he is former CIA officer. John, are you still doing shows right now?
I'm working with Michelle Whitty and Ted Rawl and Ben Zinovich. We're trying to get something together. We're just posting once a week on YouTube. It's experimental at this point, but we're hoping in the next few weeks to be able to go every day. It's called Deprogram.
Deprogrammed. All right. Yeah. Well, when you get that up and running, let me know. I'll give you guys a plug on it.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate one and only John Kiriakou. Thank you, my man. You have a good one, John.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Yeah, man. John always have some of the most fascinating stories. That he has a hell of a career and hell of a life arc. Just fascinating guy. I always appreciate when he joins me on this. Guys, we have come to the end. I want to thank all of you. Let's see. And we have a new member, Alexander G. Welcome to the family, Alexander. Thank you, my man. I really appreciate it. And Mr. Ripley, he says, I didn't know Lex Friedman spoke Russian. I'm learning stuff. Yeah, I didn't know he spoke Russian either. I had no idea. I think it's fascinating to me that they could have had that interview. Because if you listen to the interview, he is all over the place. Like Zelensky is speaking in Russian, he's speaking in Ukrainian, I think at some parts English. But it is a very weird phenomena where the guy apparently despises Russians and speaks Russian and can't even really barely speak Ukrainian. It's just super weird. Super, super weird. Yeah, just fascinating. Just fascinating. Let's see, what is this? Skeptical jerk. I hear what, Jesus Christ, I can't see it. I hear what Scar says, tells you where a little bit of truth, and he starts reading How Good America. Jesus Christ, I can't see it. I'm sorry, guys. My eyesight is a little bit weird today. How good America is and the rest of the world sucks. I don't think John said that, unless I'm misunderstanding something. He sacked out of his tiny head. Okay, I don't know what that one is. Busha Bendelu. Thanks, Jamal. Well, thank you, Busha. Here's another one. Sardushi. It says the money meant for teachers and others ended up at banks too. In Ukraine, they're thieving. Well, yeah, they're stealing our cash, to put it mildly. Olga from Kiev is baptized there. I think he had to learn Ukrainian. Are you talking about Zelensky? Yeah, he did, but he doesn't apparently speak it all that well. Constantinople fell in 1204. 1204. Think of the history. Like we have like 1,000 years of history going back over this stuff. It's just fascinating. All right. I am going to bring this to a close. We have come to the end. Federal agent Zelensky is coked up. There is a funny video that has Zelensky doing the Les Freeman interview with like piles of cocaine in front of Les Freeman. It is utterly hilarious. One last thing before I let you go. And I'm going to say a trigger warning for this because, and I can't even really show the video per se. This woman's name is Namia Jamarl. She's an Ethiopian woman. And she is currently up for sale. She's currently up for sale. I can't play this video because I think YouTube would take it off. But effectively, this woman is being tortured. She's being tortured. And she is up for sale for apparently $6,000. You can buy her for less than you can buy a car in the States. The person who did this and was responsible for this just got an award from Joe Biden. And she got that award. Joe Biden took this moment to give his Democratic cretins and other cantankerous troglodytes of his party awards, almost like medals. Here's your medal. You've been a great American. Here, Liz Cheney. Here's your medal. You've been a great American. These people were directly responsible for the destruction of one government after the next, especially Hillary Clinton. That woman who's being tortured is being tortured today because Hillary Clinton and Obama thought it was perfectly fine to put a bunch of jihadists to take over and destroy the Libyan government, with Gaddafi getting sodomized by a machete and Hillary Clinton laughing and giggling at how great it was that Gaddafi was murdered. Okay, fair enough. You got rid of him. And now you have a country that turned into a basket case where, yes, they were auctioning Black people as slaves. In that situation, a woman is being tortured as a result of that government and that country being in the condition that it's in. Just utterly disgusting. And Joe Biden decided to give her an award. So right here, a report from Conservateur says Naomi Jamarl was kidnapped in Libya, tortured, and ransomed for $6,000 for freedom. People are being trafficked in Libya, a country that was one of the richest in Africa, and it's now a bit of a dumpster fire. Thanks, Hillary Clinton. And to thank Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden gave her the stupid medal, which effectively gets across that the medal is not worth the metal that it's made from. All right, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. And I'm going to say subscribe. You got to have a fantastic day. I may see you later this evening. I need to cut some of these videos, but you guys have a good one. Jamarl Thomas Morning Show, episode 72. Signing off. Be safe, guys.